Reborn. Evolving from Nothing Chapters 11 to 20. Chapter 11. Lucky Day. The mountainous region Dorian was in was known as the Nebra Mountains. The large forest to the south was called the Thousand Oak Forest. The mountains stretched for several dozen miles, while the forest stretched for nearly 300 miles, taking up huge tracts of land, all of it filled with beasts. The location Dorian had originally spawned in it was found roughly 20 miles from the Nebra Mountains, in a small, nondescript clearing near a river. A rough dirt crater marred this otherwise picturesque locale, a crater which grass and plants were just now starting to reclaim. On the brook of this river, a young salamander with green scales, roughly 3/4 of a meter long, was slowly moving about, looking down carefully. Its claws gleamed as it prepared to pounce on any unfortunate fish that came near it. The river shined a brilliant pearly blue, the morning sunlight reflecting off of it. Just as the salamander was preparing to pounce, a figure blurred into existence behind it and stabbed a hand through its back, directly piercing the salamander's heart. A heavy aura of blood surrounded this figure, giving it an ominous appeal. The salamander died instantly, red blood spattering on the ground and dyeing the nearby stream pink for a few seconds. Crude as always Brutus. A smooth, enthralling voice rang out from afar as another figure shimmered into existence. A petite woman that looked like a human, except for a very faint gray tinge on her skin. Her face was one of beauty, perfectly proportioned lips and gorgeous violet eyes. A small, petite nose complemented her dainty smile, while her long red hair swayed lightly in the breeze, making her appear like some sort of ethereal fairy. She wore a tight set of black leather that did nothing to hide her curves. "It's the first time I've seen this world, Gaia." The speaker shrugged, tossing the dead salamander corpse to the side. He was a big, brute of a man, bulging muscles barely covered by the loose black shirt he wore, and a pair of black leather pants, standing roughly 2 meters tall. He had short, red hair, with a rough-looking face that carried a hint of handsome charm. A strong chin and near-perfect proportions were marred by 2 very large red scars, crossing his face in an X pattern that started at each ear, and went across his cheeks, nose, and down to the sides of his neck. His skin was of a similar shade, very faintly gray. "Blood magic. Arise," Brutus said, clapping his hands together. A few small golden rings on his hands glinted, clinking quietly as they collided. Immediately, the dead salamander's body twitched. A glowing red light appeared around it as it stood up, slowly turning to face the muscular man. Brutus turned to look at Gaia, giving her a leer-filled grin, revealing a set of perfect white teeth. The only oddity in his smile were the 2 pairs of pointed teeth, 2 on top and 2 on bottom, that appeared in his mouth, glinting softly. "After you, milady," he bowed crudely. Gaia rolled her eyes, making even that look beautiful as she stepped forward. She waved her hand casually to the side. From out of seemingly nowhere, a long, red staff with a glowing white crystal shaped like an eyeball appeared, giving off a faintly demonic aura. Gaia held the staff before her, turning to focus on the arisen red salamander. "Blood magic. Drawing fate." She closed her eyes as she spoke, concentrating fully on casting her spell. Faint red lines began to rise up from the salamander, slowly connecting with the glowing crimson staff. Red symbols appeared in the air and vanished mysteriously. After a long moment, Gaia opened her eyes again. To the north, the disturbance in fate is to the north. The reverberations are getting fainter and fainter, however. After a few more weeks it will be impossible to track. Her voice rang out, tinged with a hint of excitement. Brutus shrugged. "As long as we can find it before the humans or shades do, High Lord Marcus won't care. It's a shame none of the disturbances appeared in any of our worlds. We were lucky to be on a connector planet nearby." Brutus's voice was filled with reverence at the mention of the name Marcus. Gaia simply nodded her head, and then waved her hand casually. Immediately, a pool of red blood began to appear, tentacles of red blood whipping back and forth, forming into the shape of a huge, 3-meter-tall wolf. "Salam," she whispered as she softly stroked the side of the blood wolf, her eyes filled with gentle love and care. "Lead me to the one that disturbed fate." Dorian grinned cheerfully as looked down at the meat in front of him. Today really was his lucky day. After he got up, he'd set off to go hunting. His goal today was mostly just to loaf around till he was able to evolve to a stronger form. His current form was fast, but not very strong. Therefore, to fill his stomach, he decided to hunt some fish from the river, and then go looking for some magic herbs. When he left his hidden cave, however, he found a small group of mountain deer grazing by the river. According to Asra, most of the mountain deer were either earth or mortal class. Even as a mire wormling, he should be able to handle something like that. Especially with his flame claws ability. According to Asra, every ability he learned would stick with him, no matter what physical form he had. It was a very useful benefit that he absolutely would take advantage of. Dorian had stalked the deer, slowly crawling up a tree to the side of the valley. He then quietly leapt from tree to tree, focusing on the deer down below. Eventually he reached one of the paths that led to the valley river, worn away by thousands of beasts moving over time. He hid on a tree branch, remaining absolutely still as he watched the deer. Mountain deer were large, but not too abnormally large. They were just a little bigger than regular deer, back on Earth, with tougher brown leather hide, and very solid black hooves. Eventually the deer began to leave the valley, having drunk their fill. There were roughly 20 of them, a sizable group. They began to head towards the path Dorian was hovering over. Dorian hadn't picked this path by chance. After observing the deer before, he knew their type were skittish, and would stick to routine. This path was not only one that was decently open on all sides, with only a few trees blocking one's vision, but the most well-worn path in the valley. As the deer began to travel under him, Dorian bided his time, picking out his target. A large, meaty deer at the back of the pack. He'd considered going for a weaker-looking one, but decided against it. With his current capabilities, he should have no trouble taking out a deer of this stature. Tense seconds went by, and soon that large deer was right below him. Moving quickly, Dorian jumped down from the branch he was on, activating his flame claws ability as he attacked. He had practiced the ability often enough that he could use it instantly now. His claws glowed a fiery red-white as they plunged into the flesh of the deer. A split second later the herd of deer scattered, panicking at the sight of a predator. The smell of cooked meat began to drift, sizzling. The meaty deer Dorian had attacked leapt up into the air and struggled, trying to throw Dorian off. Its muscular shoulders made its movements much stronger than that of any regular deer on Earth, each stomp exerting hundreds of pounds of pressure. Dorian was relentless in his pursuit, however, and plunged his claws deeper, feeling the struggles of the deer weaken. A few seconds passed, and the deer collapsed, its body laying still as it passed on. Dorian blinked as he looked down, finally noticing something. The smell of cooked flesh in this body, it smelled delicious. When he was in his red salamander form, he hadn't cared whether the flesh of an animal he hunted was cooked or not. The rich, raw taste of blood had been a delight to his tongue. In this body, however, Dorian wasn't sure if his taste buds had changed, but the smell of the deer in front of him was mouth-watering. He frowned as he looked down at his hands, however. The fire from his claws was a bit too hot. The flesh of the deer where his claws had landed had charred black. If he wanted to roast this deer, he'd need to figure out a way to tone down the heat on his claws, or use some other method. As he thought about this, he turned to the side, eyeing the tree next to him. In particular, a set of long, 2-inch thick branches, an idea running through his mind. Space magic. Blinking ship. Royal Wizard Iman's voice quivered as he clapped his hands together, drawing energy from his soul spell matrix to power the spell. He made several confusing motions with his hands, a stream of glowing white symbols forming in the air. After a few moments, the vague outline of a small, floating white boat took shape in the air. It gave off faint reverberations that shook the air, mystifying energy waves that were almost impossible to understand. William looked on in awe at the transparent, floating ship, his eyes curious. They were currently standing outside of your city. The city itself was around 3.5 miles wide, one of the largest cities this far west in the Obsidia River Empire. The walls of the city were one of its centerpieces, huge 10-meter-high stone walls, enchanted with spells to reinforce them. The city was a powerful stronghold, once used as a frontier city to clear out various beasts. The Obsidia River Kingdom was still in the process of expanding and conquering new territory. After touching base with the Nobel family, the de facto rulers of your city, the department wizards had stayed over at the Nobel family compound. It was currently the morning of the day after. One of William's spells created a transport vessel like this. But just by looking at the floating ship, William could already tell this one far outclassed his own. Excellent magic, the talkative fate wizard Oblong said cheerfully as the floating ship began to land, ready to be boarded. Let's get moving. Oblong turned to look at William, grinning happily. The fate wizard was extremely pleased with the results of his foretelling. He had already sent a message to the fate wizard standing with Lord Hadrian. If things turned out well, this might be the lucky break he needed to get his name out there and gain the resources he needed to step into the Grandmaster class. Yes, sir, William said, quickly stepping forward. Behind William were several Nobel family Sky-class warriors, sent by the family head to protect him. After the department wizards had left to rest, the family head had pulled him aside, urging him to cooperate fully. If he could make a good impression, it was entirely possible he could attend one of the department academies. There was, after all, a wood magic department. Any family that had a wizard in one of the 108 departments was a family destined for greatness far beyond ruling a small tract of land in a minor world like Hossnorth. William eagerly jumped on board, walking carefully. With his magic sensitivity, he was able to clearly make out the outline of the ship, but the transparentness of it was disorienting. Behind him, the Black Lightning Grandmaster Wizard Graxital stepped aboard, followed by the Black Iron Guards the Obsidia River Empire had provided. These powerful warriors were some of the highest-ranked fighters in the entire nation, members of the 5,000-man-strong Black Iron Battalion. Oblong and Eamon boarded last. As they get settled in, the space wizard Eamon raised his hands, fluttering them in the air before him before turning to face William expectantly. Now, please direct my course, young wizard. Chapter 12. Confusion. Dorian snagged a set of wooden branches, slicing them off the mid-sized tree with ease. They were sturdy pieces of some type of wood, strong and flexible. He cleared any stray leaves off them and held them under his arm, dragging them alongside the dead deer off to the side near the river. He took a few careful glances around. These mountains were a dangerous area, but he hadn't yet encountered any Grandmaster-class beasts in this valley itself. The area here seemed like a place that was relatively safe. Even if he did encounter any danger, he could just activate the King-class aura he had stored in his soul. None of the beasts he had seen had too high levels of intelligence, so more likely than not they would fall for it and run off in fear. It was time he really treated himself, for once, he decided. He felt really good after letting his emotions loose the other day. With his powerful trump card protecting him, he could afford to relax. After setting the branches and the dead deer down, Dorian quickly began to clip some of the wood. He began forming a small stack of wood for a fire, creating a pyramid shape. He took two of the longer branches, and stabbed them into the ground on opposite sides of the small wooden pyramid. They rested about 5 feet above the pyramid stack of wood. He said aloud, looking at the dead deer. I think I'm supposed to remove the intestines or something like that, right, before cooking? He rubbed a claw against his forehead, trying to remember. On Earth he had been a simple university graduate. He knew a lot about math and physics, had participated in a couple dancing clubs on campus, but he had hardly been the type to go out camping. He shrugged. Whatever, I'm a dragon. It'll probably be fine. He turned around and took one of the longer branches. He shaved the ends of each side to make it pointed, measuring it so it was about the length between the two wooden stakes in the ground. He poked 2 holes in the stakes, making sure they were high up, and double-checked to be sure the last piece of wood could connect them. He then turned to look at the deer, licking his lips. Time to get cooking. Whoosh! A small gust of wind blasted outward as the flying ship made out of magic dissipated, falling into nothingness. William looked around the mountainside they had landed on, his eyes careful. The journey here had taken a very short time. The ship the space wizard had created was able to move through space at an abnormally fast speed, blinking through the sky. It also had the ability to hide the presence of those on board, meaning it could be flown in dangerous areas. They had touched down in the middle of the mountains, very close to where William had hunted down that ironhide wolf. According to Oblong, it was because of the presence of several Grandmaster-class beasts lurking in upper region of the mountain peaks, as well as him sensing something through his fate magic. Landing directly in the valley between the shattered peaks would probably lead to them being detected and attacked even through the space magic protection when they were high in the sky. It was far safer to land on the side of one of the empty mountains. They could deal with the attacks of several Grandmaster-class beasts if they needed to. But it would be much safer if they could avoid them, and if they started a ruckus it might alert whatever anomaly they were trying to find. What exactly they were looking for Oblong hadn't made clear to William. Just that they would know it when they saw it. It only took them a few short minutes to reach the valley where William had found the Ironhide wolf. Once they reached it, however, Oblong had called them to a halt. The fat fate wizard sat on the ground, rubbing his chin. A look of curiosity covered his face. Has anything notable in history happened in this area in the past? He abruptly turned to William. William was slightly taken aback by the abrupt question. He thought about it hard before coming up with a response. Legend has it that a stray hunter found a great treasure here, more than 800 years ago. There's also a legend that a great flood of beasts rushed from these mountains after a blinding meteor crashed here, swarming and almost destroying the predecessor of your city. It's part of the reason for your city's great walls. Oblong paid close attention as he spoke, rubbing his chin a second time. He turned to his companion. I don't like it, Graxital. There's something weird here, a strange aura of death. The Black Lightning Wizard shrugged. He was currently scanning the nearby area, keeping on alert. The warriors they'd brought had set up a small perimeter, protecting them from any surprises. We can't turn back now. We'll just have to push through. His voice was cool. Oblong struggled to his feet, his portly figure trembling slightly. The royal wizard Aemon watched this all dispassionately, a slight hint of mockery in his eyes. Yes, be that as it may be. Oblong began, motioning with his hands. I still think we should make our path carefully and... Before he could finish speaking, however, one of the master-class Black Iron guards rushed forward, his helmet pulled up to reveal a face of absolute confusion. My lords. The guard's gruff voice cut off the wizards as he bowed, and then stood at attention. Yes, man? Oblong said, his voice going back to its regular cheer. We, found something, sir. He said, stumbling over his words. Found something? Well, what is it? Don't just leave us at that, man. Graxital broke in, a look of annoyance on his face. I don't know how to describe it. You'll need to see for yourself, sir. The man wiped a sheen of sweat from his forehead, motioning behind him, where a small trail of smoke was rising into the air. Careful, Salim, Gaia muttered, stroking her blood wolf slowly as it chomped down on the corpse before her. She gazed at it lovingly. A large, 3-meter blue-furred ape lay on the ground, dead, red blood flowing from its body into the huge wolf. A strange red aura seemed to merge the two beings together, giving them an odd, unholy appearance. They currently stood in the midst of the Nebra Mountains, very close to a pair of oddly shattered peaks. An eerie air filled this mountain range, making both her and Brutus shiver. Something unnatural, something deathly had happened here. Blood magic, the magic that all of her kind used, was incredibly diverse, with many different applications. There were so many branches that it was called a virtually unlimited type of magic. Even the humans studied blood magic, seeking to unlock its mysteries. They were no match for nobles like themselves, however. Their pitiful skill was nothing next to masters like herself. It's just a blood wolf. Brutus' voice crudely cut into the moment, ruining Gaia's quiet appreciation of Salim. Gaia spun around, glaring at the hulking vampire. Her eyes spat daggers at him as she responded. Salim is a beautiful boy, far more than just a blood wolf. He is more deserving of love than you, Brutus. Her eyes took on an unhinged look as she responded, a dangerous aura starting to rise around her. Small lines of red light began to hover around her arms and hands. Brutus grinned as he saw this. You want to go at it again now, Gaia? He clapped his hands together. Immediately, 2 blood-red gauntlets appeared, gleaming brightly in the mid-morning light. A look of fury appeared on the female vampire's face as she struggled to control her emotions. Slowly, she took a deep breath, rolling her eyes as she turned back to look at Salim, a sour look on her face. We'll eat more later, Salim. Let's keep moving, she said, stroking the blood wolf once more. It slowly got up, moving away from the corpse of the master-class beast. She gave Brutus one more glare before following the wolf as it headed into the valley between the 2 shattered peaks, where a lone plume of smoke rose into the sky. Dorian grinned in delight, wiping off his claws in the nearby river. Making a spit had turned out exactly as he wanted, and creating a fire had been even easier. He looked back at the roasting deer corpse, salivating already. The sizzling fat, the taste of warm, cooked meat rolling on his tongue, the juices melting in his mouth. He could already imagine it. He did a happy little dance as he walked around the fire, pleased, his luscious green scales glimmering in the sunlight. "I don't have any seasoning or sauce," he muttered, scratching his head. He took a brief glance around, failing to find anything that looked like a seasoning or sauce. And, if he was perfectly honest, he had no idea what type of plant would act as a seasoning. Were seasonings even made from plants? Parsley was, he knew that. But what was salt made from? Salt? He shrugged again, blaming his lack of interest in cooking or chemistry. If he'd known he was going to be reborn in another world where magic exists, he would have prepared much more extensively. It's not like he asked to be here. Sizzle. A sizzling sound woke Dorian from his thoughts, the deer on the wooden spit roasting smoothly. He walked up to the spit, turning the deer over. "Should I have removed the skin?" he queried, deciding the next time he cooked he would try that in the future. As he watched the meat cook on the fire, he leaned back for a moment. He felt like he was in a cowboy western, living out on the American frontier. Cooking food in the wilds of the wilderness, far and away from civilization. While the Wild West didn't exactly have dragons in it, the image still filled Dorian's mind. A tune of a song he'd heard recently, on Earth, rose up in his mind. He slowly began to hum it, tapping his clawed foot to the beat. 100 meters away, the group of human mages and warriors slowly crept through the underbrush, sneaking about. Soon, they reached an opening in the trees, where they could peer into the center of the valley, where the river ran through. Near the center of the valley, the group could make out a small green dragon, standing next to what appeared to be a large deer cooking over a fire. "Halt!" Graxital whispered fiercely, staring at the small dragon in confusion. William froze with him, his heart pounding nervously. "Do you hear that?" Graxital held his hand up, motioning at his ears, and then towards the center of the valley. William strained his ears, listening as best he could. Vaguely, he could make out an odd string of noises, coming from the small green-scaled dragon. "Country Roo adds, take me home, to the Plachi, I belong." An odd but melodious voice continued, echoing in the small valley, seemingly coming from the same small dragon before their eyes. "West Virginia, Mountain Mama, take me home." Oblong stared at the small dragon with an unknown look in his eyes, both his hands held out in the air giving off a sense of loss. "Is it singing?" Chapter 13. Godly Dragon. Gaia stood still, her head tilting to the side as she looked at the odd, tiny green dragon standing at the center of the valley. Her hand lay resting on her blood wolf, stroking his shoulder softly. She turned around and looked at Brutus. She then turned and looked back at Dorian. And then back at Brutus. And then back at Dorian. That is one of the beings that has twisted fate? That caused High Lord Marcus to send out a hunting order? Gaia's statement was more of a question, her voice filled with incredulity as she kept stroking Salem's shoulder. "If the wolf led us here, that sounds like a safe guess." Brutus responded, staring at the small, weird dragon with a bored look. Even from this distance, he could feel that it was a weak creature. He could probably defeat it with a single blow, unless it was hiding some secret power. "Is it cooking a deer over a fire?" Her voice was deadpan, almost emotionless. Her eyes, however, were completely serious. "Seems like," Brutus grunted, supremely unconcerned. "And now it's singing?" she continued, her eyes locked onto the small dragon. Dorian's singing voice carried quietly through the valley, joyfully spreading his love of West Virginia. "Yep," Brutus replied, rubbing his chin. "And now, it's dancing?" Gaia blinked, and then looked down at her hands, pinching herself. "Energetic little fella," Brutus shrugged. Gaia turned and glared at him, rolling her eyes in annoyance. "Would it kill you to show interest in anything?" Brutus gave her a grin, showing the white of his pointed, vampiric teeth. "I have quite a few interests. What would you care to learn about?" He was about to continue, giving her a leer-filled grin, but abruptly grew completely serious, his head whipping to the north. Gaia froze as well, turning her head to the opposite side of the valley, her eyes narrowing. "Humans. It's so tasty." Dorian did a little happy dance, his tiny dragon feet pitter-pattering as he ran around the fire in happiness. "Every little thing, Even the small things seemed to be so much fuller after he let go of his worries the other night. He was currently munching on an entire roast deer thigh. It was meaty and well cooked, the insides melting with juices. The flavors rolled over his tongue as he sank his teeth into them, the fat sizzling in his mouth. It's so good. Tears of joy came into his eyes. It had truly been a long time since he tasted something as good as this. Even when he was eating other beasts as a red salamander, where his taste buds had adapted for raw meat and delighted in blood, there was a certain mental limit Dorian placed. As someone with a human mindset, he just couldn't fully enjoy eating raw blood and meat. But this deer thigh, it was well cooked, juicy and delicious, the greatest thing he had eaten since he came to exist in this world. Dorian looked up at the sky and then at the deer that was still roasting on the spit. He bowed slightly, showing his respect. It was right after, however, that he noted the presence of several human beings walking towards him, causing him to instantly go on alert. "Hey little guy," Oblong motioned with his hands in a non-threatening way, keeping his voice and tone down. After observing the small green dragon, he could tell it wasn't very powerful. Wizards were very sensitive to the strength of other beings, and could usually tell if a being had a stronger soul spell matrix than them. He'd also cast a very fast fate cantrip, designed to glean general information about a being. From that, he discovered that the creature was very young for a dragon, though his spell results had thrown him slightly. The dragon was either a relatively small number of days old, or around 20 to 25 years in age. His spell couldn't seem to decide. It was the curse of fate magic, he'd thought, shaking his head in exasperation. Any spell that tried to unravel fate was bound to be difficult to understand, especially the less information you had about someone or something. Still, the beast before them was definitely odd, and definitely young, and his magic indicated that fate around it was twisted. It was the target they were looking for. He motioned with his hands again, this time in a gentle waving gesture, indicating for the guards to step forward and start to encircle the dragon. They couldn't have it escaping. Graxital kept a close watch on the beast, his hands behind his back gathering a small ball of black energy. The royal wizard Aemon, meanwhile, watched everything dispassionately, staying at the back of the group. He didn't seem to trust anything about the appearance of the beast before him, probably something that came from experience. "Just relax, we're just here to come talk. Let's be friends." Oblong continued babbling nonsense, focusing on his tone. No one here was fluent in Draconic, and while whatever the dragon wormling had been singing wasn't in Draconic, it certainly wasn't in a language he understood. The small green dragon stood frozen, raising a half-eaten deer thigh to its mouth as it stared back at the approaching humans. It seemed like it was about to bolt, its body starting to tremble. "William," Oblong said, turning his eyes to the side briefly. The young wood magic wizard had proven adaptable and calm, even when faced with surprises. Oblong had been quite impressed with his performance thus far. In addition, wood magic was truly a versatile and useful type of magic. William stepped forward, his eyes focused on the small drake. A slight drop of sweat rolled down his forehead as he concentrated, not letting himself slip up. For some odd reason, the dragon he was zoning in on seemed to be glaring reproachfully at him. "Wood magic. Seelie, watch out." Graxital's normally quiet voice shook the valley as he abruptly yelled out loud, interrupting William. Crap. Dorian split into panic as he saw the approaching humans, freezing up. He had no idea what to do. Should he run? He held the roasted deer thigh in his hand, almost as if to use it as a club. His heart began to pound, causing him to tremble with whatever the draconic equivalent of adrenaline was. As he was now, in his baby dragon form, he definitely wasn't able to confront anything tough. In addition, he recognized one of the humans here. It was the same human that had tried to attack him in his red salamander form. One that had used magic. He gave the human a glare for good measure. "Hey little guy." One of the humans began speaking one of the languages Dorian now knew, Common. He was a very overweight man wearing a set of loose blue robes, with a poor attempt at a friendly look on his face. The man waved at him in a non-threatening manner. Around him, however, several humans wearing black armor started to surround Dorian. "Just relax, we're just here to come talk. Let's be friends." Dorian mentally rolled his eyes at the man's words, despite his heart full of panic. "Sure you are, buddy," he thought, his eyes darting from side to side. He felt oddly threatened by the humans in front of him, his senses telling him that they were stronger than him. The closer the warriors got, the closer the robed men got, the bigger that sense was. Can I run? Dorian's eyes darted to the side, his body tensing. The warriors in black armor, however, seemed to move far more swiftly than they appeared to be, already cutting off most escape routes. By the time Dorian tried to flee, he felt as if they would instantly catch up with him. His eyes glinted as he forced himself to calm down, controlling his fear and analyzing the situation. It seemed he would need to rely on the aura stored by his soul spell matrix in his soul. The wizard he had seen before stepped forward. Wood magic. Seelie, watch out. He was just about to draw on that aura when a small explosion detonated, knocking into several of the warriors that were surrounding him. The black-armored men to his right and left were thrown backwards as what appeared to be a several-meter-large eruption of blood appeared, blasting them backwards. Small shockwaves slammed into Dorian, stunning him as the scene around him abruptly unfolded into chaos. Blood magic. It's some damned nobles. Look alive. Graxital yelled out loud, launching the ball of black lightning he had formed earlier forward, towards a spot on the opposite side of the clearing. A pair of tall oak trees exploded into wooden shrapnel as his attack slammed into that area, creating a small distraction. He immediately clapped his hands together and then raised them up, casting a spell. Black lightning magic. Black calling. Overhead, nearly 1,000 meters above them, several lines of black energy formed, starting to rotate. Gradually, nearly clouds became drawn into this vortex, slowly becoming something ominous. A heavy, black aura of energy surrounded Graxital, shivering around him. Aemon, the royal wizard, waved his hands, concentrating as he created a transparent spatial barrier that surrounded his body, protecting him. Casting spells without calling their names aloud was an extremely difficult feat that one could only manage after many years of experience and practice targeting one specific spell. Oblong gave him a sidelong irritated glance for an instant, creating a spatial barrier to protect only himself. It wasn't exactly unexpected, since they weren't comrades, and it wasn't wrong of him either. Your own personal safety as a wizard was paramount, and even department wizards couldn't force other wizards to do what they said, not if they were of equal or greater strength under the laws of the Boral autarchy. But it still annoyed him. Oblong grunted and held his hands out in front of him, his long experience as a department wizard coming into play as he maintained his calm. Fate magic. Lucky guard. A green glow briefly surrounded him. Not a split second later, several dozen arrows of glowing red blood shot forward, targeting the wizards at the base of the group, ignoring the scattered and wounded warriors. These arrows hurtled forward at breakneck speed, carrying a deadly strength. Only a few blood arrows went towards the royal wizard, and all of them failed to even scratch Aemon's spatial barrier. Every single arrow that went towards Oblong seemed to just barely miss him, entirely by lucky chance. The arrows that tried to slam into Graxital shriveled as they came into contact with the black aura surrounding him, failing to do any harm. William, unfortunately, took the brunt of the damage here. He was knocked backwards off his feet, slamming several meters through the air. Oblong cursed mentally at this, blaming his own poor planning. The difference between a master class and a sky class wizard wasn't just in their concentration of energy. Once any wizard reached the master class, their soul spell matrix transformed slightly, granting them a powerful innate barrier. This barrier would be active at all times, but only drawing energy when an attack landed on it. The barrier itself used a huge amount of energy, and was inefficient compared to protective magic. However, simply having this protective barrier was a huge safeguard against surprise attacks or physical attacks. William, unfortunately, had no such barrier, and either wasn't experienced enough or strong enough to raise a powerful protective spell in time. The bastard son of an important family looked down at his body as he crashed into a set of trees hard, feeling his ribs and legs fracture. Two enormous holes could be seen, one in the lower portion of his chest, and one on his hip, holes that completely drilled through bone and flesh. Not a trace of blood could be seen in these wounds. His lips turned pale as he was overwhelmed with pain. With shaky hands, he twirled both fingers, stuttering out, "Wood magic. Great elm's healing branches." Shortly after, he collapsed, his body going into shock at the horrendous wounds, falling unconscious. Around him, several small branches grew from the ground and began to cover his body in a cocoon. A moment later, two figures walked into the clearing. One enormous hulking brute of man, with a set of crimson gauntlets on his hands and arms, and another gorgeous woman, wearing a thin, revealing set of black leather armor. Their skin had a faint, gray skin tone, and an aura of blood surrounded both. Damned nobles! Oblong swore aloud, holding his hands before him as he took charge. Aemon watched everything in his continued dispassion, not even trying to help. Oblong could even sense him preparing to flee, using his space magic. He mentally swore again. This is human territory. You have no right to be here. Leave immediately. Oblong threatened them, stalling for time while Graxital charged up his spell. Vampire nobles, or nobles as they were oft called, were one of the contenders for dominance in the 30,000 worlds. While the Boral Autraki controlled more than 10,000 worlds, the three vampire families controlled only 91 worlds. That wasn't because they were weak. Far from it. The High Lords at the helm of each vampire family were able to contend with the Mad Kin the Wizard King Telman. Oblong mentally corrected himself, carefully studying the two figures before him. That said, the High Lords could only contend. Even if all three worked together, they would be unable to defeat Telman. That man was simply an abnormality in his own right. The nobles seemed to abhor change, usually remaining in the worlds they had already conquered, ruling them as they saw fit. Thus, the Autraki and the noble families didn't collide too often, not after the Autraki learned which worlds they controlled. Even the weakest vampire was equivalent in strength to an Earth-class beast, after all, far surpassing the weakest humans. The Autraki had far bigger problems to focus on, like the Draconic tribes or the Grawl alliance. Oblong shook the stray thoughts from his mind as he focused on the nobles in front of him, readying himself to react. There was no chance these two were here by chance. They must be after the disturbance in Fade 2. Leave? The woman's voice softly filled the valley air, a hint of glee in it. The big brute of a man stepped forward, giving a grin that showed his pointed teeth. Why would we leave after finding such delightful food? Salam, come. She clapped her hands with a warm smile. Immediately after, an enormous, hulking bloodwolf appeared, stomping into the valley proper. Oblong's eyes widened as he saw it, and he cursed yet again. He swiftly began planning a withdrawal route in case Graxital was unable to handle them. The female noble before him must be at the peak of the Grandmaster class, at minimum, to have such an enormous bloodwolf familiar. Vampires had incredibly regenerative skills, innate access to powerful blood magic with experience that far outstripped even the most skilled human blood wizards, and extreme physical endurance and strength. Oblong clenched his fists in rage, his eyes turning bloodshot and the fat on his body trembling. He'd come all this way, and even found the disturbance in Fate, the small, weak green dragon, and it seemed he might lose out to a pair of deviled bloodsuckers. At this thought, Oblong shifted his eyes to the ground between the vampires and him, where the green dragon lay on the ground in fear. No, not on the ground in fear, Oblong observed in that split second. The dragon was, oddly enough, leaning forward with its chest puffed out, as if it was about to yell, its body trembling. It was at that moment that every living being in the valley froze completely. Every animal within 10 miles abruptly began to tremble, Master-class beasts on distant mountains directly collapsing, Grandmaster-class beasts in the midst of sleeping, battle, or rest freezing in terror, their eyes widening in horror. For at that moment, an aura began to spread out, an aura so devastatingly threatening that the air itself seemed to shake. An awe-inspiring, majestic red haze descended and gathered upon the tiny green-scaled dragon, as if he was a mythical beast of legend. You dare ignore this godly dragon? Chapter 14. Bluffing. On the outside, Dorian was the picture of a cool, confident, godly dragon giving off an unsurpassed aura with simmering arrogance. His scales gleamed, the red haze of power that surrounded him accentuating his draconic nature. On the inside, Dorian was freaking out. Back when he was a human, one of his favorite hobbies had been dancing. He'd performed on several small dance teams at his college, nothing too serious, but still something he enjoyed. He'd also participated in a few small plays in high school, and a single musical in college. Stage fright was a terrible thing, but it was a fear he had thought conquered. Now, however, as Dorian put up an angry face, glaring in fury at the warriors and wizards surrounding him, he realized that was a sentiment that could not be more wrong. His body trembled against his will as he slowly turned his neck, glaring at each offending side. He could only pray they didn't notice. He wasn't even sure if his face actually looked angry. How was he supposed to know how a dragon's facial expressions looked? His eyes glowed as he forced himself to focus, feeling as if he was about to be sick. After the two sides began fighting, Dorian had immediately seen how dangerous a situation he was in. The sheer power and strength each side showed off was something he could easily die from. A stray blast of that black lightning could incinerate him. It would be impossible to sneak away safely, not when he was directly between the two sides, and standing still and doing nothing would be like asking to die. So, he did the only thing he could think of. "Asra, how'd I activate the aura we stored?" he'd asked as the battle began to unfold. "Simply will it surround you from your soul, like a warm blanket covering you." Asra's response had been concise, but informative. Just like the genie in his soul spell matrix said, activating the aura was like drawing a blanket around him, covering himself. He'd mentally willed the small red bead in his soul to move, drawing upon it. As he did so, the bead visible grew smaller, losing roughly 1/4 its mass. An incredible feeling of power and strength sweltered upon him. He felt as if he was looking upon the world with dominance, as if every being here was made to live under his rule. The feeling was addicting, sweeping through his mind with abandon. Drawing from that feeling as inspiration, Dorian began acting like how he thought a godly dragon would act. Thump thump, thump thump, thump thump. Graxital saw his death. He stood absolutely still, not daring to move a muscle. His heart pounded, sounding like the footsteps of a great, lumbering behemoth in his ears. His eyes were completely open as he put his full and complete attention on the tiny green dragon in front of him. The small dragon gave off an aura that was so incredibly mighty that Graxital knew that if he moved, he would be killed within seconds. Its deep, black eyes gleamed with unspeakable anger as it stared into his soul. Even now, he could see the monstrous dragon shaking in rage, its aura palpitating off of it. Its face was pulled up in an unnatural, hideous snarl, grotesque and horrifying to look at. The half-eaten deer thighbone it held in its claws was like a sword of destruction, power pulsing around it. The beast was clearly beyond reasoning with. It was a wonder that he was still alive, in fact. Graxital was a tried and true magician, a wizard that had been trained in the Black Lightning Department for more than 12 years. He had reached the Grand Master class just last year, and was considered one of the most experienced wizards in his age group. It was because of this that he managed to secure a position under Lord Hadrian, the rising star of the Black Lightning Department. His late father had always told him that hard work would bring results, but only if whom you worked for was an honest man. And Lord Hadrian was gruff, forbearing, but most of all honest. He'd only followed the man for a year, but had been extremely impressed with his integrity and the care he showed, not only for himself, but for all the wizards and humans around him. His gruff, silent personality was merely a cloak for a great man. As his life flashed before his eyes, Graxital felt himself reach a sense of inner peace. He needed to warn Lord Hadrian. This vile, twisted dragon before him, a creature that was at least at the peak of the Lord class, maybe stronger. Even Lord Hadrian could be killed if taken by surprise. He could not let that man perish. And he was willing to die to ensure that. Far, up above, his spell Black Calling had finished, several enormous clouds having formed in the air above them, slowly rotating. It was a powerful elemental gathering spell, making use of the environment to strengthen one's attack. Unfortunately, an attack of this scale that wouldn't even be able to scratch the dragon in front of him he knew, not even bothering to try. He closed his eyes, and then opened them, a calm smile appearing on his face. Lightning magic. Requiem above. He made his move all at once, pouring every fiber of energy he had in his body into casting this spell. They could not depend on the mercy of this beast to spare them. Even Aemon, the space wizard, was frozen in terror, unable to flee. Requiem above was a special spell, unique to lightning magic. It made use of the ambient energy to create a large shockwave. This spell was usually used to blast away large numbers of attacks in the air, detonating in an explosion. It was a rather uncommon spell, and few wizards in the Black Lightning Department studied it. He nodded and smiled as he began to slip into unconsciousness, seeing the shockwave start to expand 1,000 meters in the sky. The last thing he saw was that horrifying, evil dragon glaring death at him, and his comrade Oblong giving him a smile of acceptance, his eyes gleaming with tears at his sacrifice. Oblong stared at his idiot companion, his face frozen in a smile of pure, unadulterated rage. He'd known Graxital was the quiet type when they'd partnered up, but had been completely unaware of his apparently suicidal nature. "Are you trying to get us all killed?" His eyes were bloodshot, tears of frustration and fury welling up as he saw Graxital cast his spell and then collapse. Oblong's arms trembled as he dashed forward, grabbing a hold of the fool's body. What a terribly unlucky day. Far above, an enormous shockwave began to spread out, blasting apart the clouds that had formed. A small explosion of black lightning shot up into the air, crackling. Around the black lightning, white energy began to crackle, further fueling the expanding shockwave. Blasting off like an enormous signal beacon, Oblong realized his companion's intentions then, cursing him in his head. The idiot might be fine sacrificing himself, but Oblong certainly wasn't. Boom! The remnants of the shockwave slammed into them, shivering as it collided with Oblong's innate barrier. He forced himself to duck down, bowing as he faced the green dragon. Several of the warriors standing off to the side were stunned by the impact, a few of them even falling to the ground. "Our deepest apologies, your lordship," he stuttered out, proud of himself for not stopping. Every word he spoke had to be forced from his mouth, his heart shaking. The godly dragon merely stared at him, its eyes unfocused as if it was ignoring him. It then blinked, its eyes piercing towards Oblong with all the might of an ancient beast. "Be gone," its voice thundered out, a single word filled with arrogance. Oblong trembled, the fat on his body jostling as he swallowed hard, forcing himself to not fall unconscious. Several of the guards nearby had collapsed from fear and terror, unable to hold themselves up. He bowed his head again, the awe-inducing aura making it hard to concentrate. Oblong jerked Graxital's unconscious body into the hands of one of the warriors that were standing nearby. All of them, whether they were the Black Iron Guards or the soldiers provided by the Nobel family, stared at Oblong like he was their only hope. He made another jerking motion. Quickly, the soldiers grabbed their wounded or injured, and began to back out of the valley. The royal wizard Aemon led the retreat, readying himself to cast a large-scale spatial magic to get them as far away as possible. "HMPH, who are you to demand we do anything, Drake?" As they were fleeing, Oblong vaguely heard the voice of one of the nobles call out at the dragon, filled with arrogance. He grinned cruelly as he heard this. The idiot was asking for death. He smirked as he hurriedly ran away, pleased that at least the nobles would suffer from this more than them. As he fled, he couldn't shake the sinking sensation that he'd forgotten something. Dorian had froze when he saw one of the wizards cast a spell, his heart dropping as he thought he'd been seen through. However, it seemed the wizard was only dispersing a spell he'd cast earlier that caused the clouds to gather. A huge shockwave had arisen as a result of this, stunning Dorian and nearly knocking his tiny dragon body unconscious. When he came to, finally clearing his eyes, he saw the worried look of the fat wizard staring at him, quivering. Dorian forced himself to continue playing the part of a godly dragon, filled his voice was as much arrogance as he could muster as he yelled out as loud as he could. "Be gone." He almost hiccuped as he made himself glare angrily, daring the humans to respond. His bluff seemed to have worked as he watched the group of human warriors and wizards begin to flee, grabbing their companions and running from the valley. Just as they were exiting, however, Dorian was forcibly reminded that there was another side here. "HMPH, who are you to demand we do anything, Drake?" Gaia's voice boiled out, domineering and arrogant, her eyes piercing towards the small dragon, a gleam in them. "What the fuck are you doing?" Brutus motioned with his hands, talking in one of the two vampiric languages, the silent language spoken by hand. The powerful warrior was incredibly on edge, having retreated backwards several dozen steps when the dragon unleashed its aura. His eyes continued to track both the dragon and Gaia as he responded, ready to flee at a moment's notice. "Its body is clearly heavily weakened, you see it as well as I. It must be a heavily injured beast, reduced to this state with only its aura remaining. No natural beast could have that aura while also being so young." Gaia replied back, her eyes flashing. Vampires had incredibly adept senses, far surpassing that of humans. Even now, both Brutus and her could clearly tell that the dragon before them was weak, physically only at the Earth class, unlike a powerful beast. Her words had a certain level of logic to them. Her heart was still filled with nervous fear, however, the aura before them truly too incredible. If she was wrong, this is a 1 in a million chance. She continued, her hand trembling in both fear and excitement as she grit her teeth. If they could get the blood of a beast that was at least at the peak of Lord class for free. Beasts that had a bloodline that could reach the Lord class were very rare and very powerful. Those that could reach the King class were even rarer, and those that could reach the angelic class were almost entirely unheard of. Blood magic had an entire host of spells that required the blood of outside beings. A Lord class's beast's bloodline would prove immensely useful to them, something neither of them could hope to afford or gain as they were now, not in any sufficient amount. It would be that final push she needed, Gaia believed, to break past the barrier of the Grandmaster class. Gaia steeled her heart, ready to risk it all as she cast a spell. Blood magic. Sweltering shade. Immediately, a dark aura of blood rose and spread into the air. You dare offend this godly dragon? Gaia cringed as she heard the dragon's roar, the fear in her heart rising. Her spell continued spreading, causing the valley to start falling into darkness. The fact that the dragon hadn't moved was the only thing reassuring her that her guess was accurate. You think darkness will affect this godly dragon? Foolish mortal, I was born in the darkness. Molded by it, you have merely adopted it. The dragon waved the half-eaten deer thigh bone in its claws at her in a threatening and dismissive manner, looking at her with what seemed to be supreme confidence as the light in the valley faded away. Gaia's hands trembled as she stared at the green-scaled dragon, visible only to her thanks to her spell. This dragon was the real deal. She wholeheartedly believed that if it hadn't been injured and weakened, it would utterly destroy them. Its origins seemed to be terrifying. Salam, she called out, twisting her fingers. Immediately, the powerful blood wolf appeared in front of her, its body shivering with power. Gaia studied two branches of blood magic, that of manipulating blood and blood beasts, and that of drawing fate. Salam was the blood beast she had raised for years, the cornerstone of her strength, and her proudest creation. She had formed him from the bloodlines of several other powerful wolves, creating a massive beast of beauty and power. Swallow it whole. Her eyes shook as she focused on the small dragon through the darkness and the red haze of power that surrounded the dragon, ordering her blood wolf forward. The wolf dashed forward without a worry, inherently following her commands. Its footsteps pounded on the dirt ground, crashing down without pause. As it did so, both she and Brutus jumped backwards, preparing to flee at a moment's notice if anything went wrong. Brutus, in fact, fled back nearly 40 meters farther than she did, his fists clenched as he glared at her angrily. Die, you bastard, she mentally whispered, watching her 3-meter-tall blood wolf slam into the small, green dragon, praying that the dragon would be killed. Several bloodlines have been detected. Do you wish to absorb them? Chapter 15. The Old Mage. Several hundred meters underground, beneath the valley between the shattered peaks, a small cave existed. This cave was blocked off from the surface, and filled with an incredibly heavy aura of death. This aura was so powerful it seeped into the earth itself, exuding the faintest trace of aura to the mountains and valley above. The cave was small, only a couple dozen meters wide. The most unique aspect about this cave was its shape. It was entirely circular, like a large sphere cut from the ground. The walls were smooth, unlined by dust or cracks. The aura Dorian unleashed was full of might, but at its core still a degraded version of the aura the fallen angelic class wizard had held in life. He had only managed to condense and store it, making use of the unique soul spell matrix he had. Still, even when Dorian unleashed the degraded version, its reach spread out for miles on the surface, and hundreds of meters into the sky above, and the ground below. And, at that exact moment, the slightest hint of that aura reached this cave, deep underground. The moment it did, golden light began to appear, a small ball appearing at the center of the cave. An old, aged voice spoke aloud. My successor. When the pale, slightly gray-skinned woman began to yell back at Dorian, he knew he was in trouble. He played it cool, however, his success in driving away the humans empowering him. He could do this. The strength of the aura he emitted was slowly beginning to fade, he noted with alarm. The red haze that surrounded his body had thinned, almost imperceptibly. If this lasted much longer, he would need to draw on it again, using up another quarter of one of his trump cards. Asra, can I use one of my absorptions on them? He still had 2 chances left to absorb almost anything that held a bloodline. However, according to the safeguards the God King had set, he would have to immediately become whatever he absorbed, and if that being, form was too strong for his soul to bear, he could collapse and perish. Asra had made this clear to him. These two appeared to be vampire nobles, both in the Grandmaster class judging by their physical appearance and intensity of blood aura. Your soul would be unable to bear the burden. Asra's replied. Dorian blinked, a sinking feeling in his stomach. Blood magic. Sweltering shade. The woman called out the words to a spell. Immediately, some odd type of red fog began to form and began covering the sky. So be it, he thought, steeling himself. He'd made it this far, he would make it a bit farther. You dare offend this godly dragon? Dorian roared out, puffing out his tiny dragon chest with all his might. His voice almost cracked as he said the last word, parched from all this yelling. The female vampire noble shuddered. It seemed his aura was still having an effect. All hope was not lost. Quick, he thought, frantically. He needed to say something intimidating, something that would scare them off, and make him sound like a majestic dragon of the heavens. As darkness swallowed the valley, inspiration struck. You think darkness will affect this godly dragon? Foolish mortal, I was born in the darkness. Molded by it, you have merely adopted it. His voice thundered as he waved his roast deer leg threateningly, quoting a character from a movie back on Earth as he tried to sound menacing. He couldn't make out where the vampires were due to the darkness, but he glared in their general direction. The crimson fog blocked off all light completely, making it impossible for Dorian to see, even when his draconic body. All of a sudden, he heard a loud thudding on the ground. A split second later, he felt more than saw something slam into him and then envelop him. His entire body was instantly surrounded and chained down, unable to move. A heavy aura of blood began to suppress his mind, causing his consciousness to waver. His body felt like it was being crushed. No matter how he struggled or moved, he couldn't stop this feeling, some odd magic spell crashing upon him. Welp, he sighed, mentally exhausted. It's been a good run. Goodbye, cruel world. As the inevitably of his death seemed to sink in on him, he felt tired and hopeless, a strange calm coming over him. Several bloodlines have been detected. Do you wish to absorb them? Asra's voice in his head was like a cool oasis in a fiery desert of darkness. Yes, yes, fucking yes, he mentally screamed, his body barely holding on, desperately clinging back to life. The strange calm from before vanished instantly, torn asunder. Absorbing detected bloodlines. Bloodline origins. 29% Golem Wolf. 25% Black Mire Wolf. 24% White Rain Wolf. 15% Virulent Wolf. 5% True Vampire. 2% Various undetermined bloodlines too small to currently measure. Immediately, a screen appeared in his mind, listing the bloodline origins of the beast that had attacked and enveloped him. He felt a rush as a large amount of energy was absorbed and stored in his soul spell matrix, awaiting his evolution. At the same time, the spell attacking him disappeared entirely, the pressure weighing him down vanishing, and he heard a loud scream. Arrrrgh. Salam no. Gaia felt a vile, horrible tearing sensation in her soul as her innate connection with her blood beast, Salam, was shorn through. Agonizing pain ripped through her consciousness as she trembled in shock. A split second later, the beautiful vampire's eyes rolled up in the back of her head and she collapsed, unconscious. Damn. Brutus made a split-second decision as he saw this. His years of experience had led to him encountering several life or death situations, but this one was like no other. Blood magic. Caesar's burn. His body was racked with dark, crimson light as he cast one of the strongest spells he knew. Caesar's burn, a spell created by a long-dead High Lord vampire, sacrificed 10 years of one's lifespan to temporarily boost one's strength to an enormous height. After casting the spell, however, one would become incredibly weak for several weeks, and be unable to cast magic for several months. It was a spell that only someone with the abnormal regenerative prowess of a vampire could manage. If a human tried to cast it, their body would directly collapse from the strain. His heart pounded, knowing this was the biggest disaster he had ever faced in his life. Any being that could casually destroy a Grandmaster-class bloodbeast was a being that could end his life with ease. Immediately, Brutus leapt forward, snatching a hold of Gaia. His body moved so blazingly fast it was a blur, every step he took sending massive cracks into the rocky ground. He scooped up her body and tossed it over his shoulder, and then hurled himself to the south. He paid no attention to the condition of his body, brutally pulling on every fiber of his being. Several of his bones cracked as he pushed them to an extreme, dashing outward away from the valley, covering more than 1,000 meters in just seconds. The only thought on his mind the horror he, a proud vampiric war mage, felt upon the sight of that terrifying beast. Dorian growled ferociously as he maintained his position, light gradually creeping into the valley as the bloody fog faded. A large pool of blood stained the ground near him. Several small holes and cracks decimated the valley, turning the once peaceful paradise into a cratered battleground. It seemed the attack that had tried to crush him had been made entirely of blood from several types of wolves. Any blood his body touched was blood he could absorb due to his unique soul spell matrix. Attacking him with a spell made out of blood was like offering him up a refreshing snack. He carefully looked to the left and right, his eyes alert. He saw no one. A crackling noise caught his ears and he spun around, his teeth pulled up in a snarl. Miraculously, the fire that he was roasting a deer at was somehow still lit. The deer was still on the spit, and part of it had set to sizzling. The fight had seemed like it lasted forever, yet in reality had only taken a few short minutes. Dorian slowly walked over to the fire, putting it out. The deer was fully cooked, and any more time on the spit would most likely burn it. Though, there was no chance he could eat anything right now. He set down his half-eaten deer thigh. The powerful, red aura he had unleashed gradually began to fade away, dissipating around him. He glanced at the deer before stalking over to the river. He looked down at his reflection. His green scales were stained red, covered in dark blood, giving him a ferocious appearance. No fish could be seen in the river, all of them having fled due to the aura he unleashed and the impacts of the battle. Dorian jumped into the river, shaking off the blood. He then swam over to the small hole, hidden in the side of the river. He quickly entered the small, hidden cave, holding his breath as he swam all the way down to where he had found the dead wizard's empty spatial pouch and bones. The cave was the same as before. A long, damp room with a low ceiling, half filled with water. As soon as he made it safely into the cave, hidden away, Dorian collapsed on the ground, his body shaking haphazardly. Ha ha ha, ha 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 ha, ha 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 ha. He began laughing uncontrollably, tears streaming down his face. The noises echoed in the underground cave, bouncing off the walls. His emotions exploded down a huge range, fear, horror, self-doubt, joy, and excitement mixing together. I'm alive. He spoke the words aloud, shaking as the tension and stress of the previous few minutes hit him. I'm alive. He laughed again, his tiny dragon claws clinking together as he air pumped. Yes, yes, yes. He let loose, his emotions rioting. He began to dance around the cave, celebrating, his tiny dragon feet clinking on the hard stone floor. Fuck you shitty vampires. Fuck you shitty humans. He spun around, victorious, conveniently ignoring the fact that he was once human. Did you think you could kill this godly dragon with your pathetic strength? Dorian was giddy with excitement, the fear of the moment washing off as he took joy in simply being alive still. As he was in the midst of celebration, Osra's cool voice cut through his mind. Your soul has sufficiently adapted, thanks in part to a spurt of growth over the past few minutes. Evolving to Mire Dragon's second growth stage, the valley returned to a semblance of norm as both the humans and the vampire nobles fled from the area, the animals and wildlife gradually returning. A calm breeze picked up and blew through the valley, casting away the stench of blood and destruction. As Dorian's body began to evolve, safely hidden within his cave, a small, glowing ball of light appeared in the valley, standing where Dorian had been just a few minutes ago. Successor? An aged voice spoke aloud, emanating from the golden ball. Gradually, the figure of an elderly man appeared, transparent and ephemeral. This elderly man was dressed in a long, white robe, adorned with golden lace. The emblem of a sun was emblazoned on the center of the robe, beams of light shooting out from it. He had a kindly, tired face, with a bald head and a long, white beard. His piercing red eyes scanned the valley, noting everything. The man appeared and turned to look directly at the underground Dorian, whose body was currently transforming. No, you merely have a similar aura within you. Refined from a remnant of my own aura, it seems. How impressive. The aged voice sighed with disappointment. He could not bestow his inheritance to someone that wasn't already a wizard, and while some dragons did study magic, the one before him clearly did not. The elderly man watched the small dragon's body transform with interest. It seemed to be growing from a wormling to a young adult dragon, at a vastly accelerated pace. It seems I am to perish today, as is my magic. The old man rubbed his chin, a deep-set sadness in his eyes. His body was a collection of his remnant soul and soul spell matrix, formed after his death so many years ago. He had hidden in this valley for many years, awaiting a successor from his kingdom, hoping they would find him and the hidden messages he sent out. He had gone to rest after some unknown period of time, deciding to awaken only when he felt an aura similar to his own. Unfortunately, it seemed his plans had failed. He sighed again, accepting his loss. It seemed his magic truly would perish today, the experiences and knowledge he'd gained passing on into the dark. At that moment, a small groan caught the attention of the aged wizard. Off to the side, next to a pair of cracked trees, a young wizard lay deathly injured, covered by a collection of healing branches from a great elm. No, he corrected himself mentally, it was a magical recreation of the healing branches of a great elm, and a very skilled one. Despite this act of healing magic, the young wizard's wounds were far too grievous. Death seemed unavoidable if he continued down this path. The elder mage Horhavel looked at the dying wizard, his eyes filled with pity. He could gather what had happened to the young man from the remnants of the situation around him. A great battle had taken place here, quite recently. He could detect traces of the blood aura of vampire nobles, and a powerful, vibrant energy that could only come from lightning magic, as well as some delicate strings of fate magic. All of them at the master or grandmaster class. The young wizard here studied wood magic, one of the more versatile styles of magic, but was only at the sky class. He could faintly sense the wavelength of the injured man's soul, and could tell he wasn't evil. Clearly, his companions had betrayed him, or left him to die, casting him aside. Just like myself, Horhavel muttered, his eyes gleaming over, memories of his own death arising. Betrayed by his trusted companions, bitterly left for dead after robbing him of his chance at reaching ascension. His eyes gleamed sharply, his fists clenching. He looked down at the dying young man, making a decision. Why bother caring if this man was from his clan? His clan had yet to find him, after all these years, and if he perished now, without passing on his inheritance, his magic and knowledge would leave this world forever, wasted. And the situation the man was in touched him, deeply at a core level. He would save this man, and make him his successor. But for that to happen, he would need a favor. The old wizard turned his head to look underground, where a certain dragon was dancing in celebration at its newfound growth in strength. Chapter 16. Reflection. Mire Dragon. Growth Stage, 2 quarters, Mire Young Adult. Growth Progress 1208 8620ths. New ability gained. Dorian's body elongated, his wings stretching and pulling out, his snout becoming longer, and even more draconic. His body morphed from its diminutive stature to a huge 3 meters of height, his body elongating to between 5 and 6 meters in length. His green scales seemed to take on a mysterious luster, shining even in the dim light of the cave. His senses seemed to expand, his eyesight growing sharper, his hearing growing more powerful, his sense of smell stronger. The relaxing sounds of a moving river, the fresh scent of the water, the subtle gleaming of the dim moss. Everything around him came more into focus. He also felt that it was now incredibly cramped in here now, his body smashing up against the low ceiling. Ow, Osra, can I go back to being small? He mentally yelped, temporarily ignoring the other messages that appeared in his mind. Yes, now that your soul has fully adapted to this new form, you are able to morph into any forms you have grown. Reverting to a lower growth stage is also possible, but will require a constant suppression of your growth, and therefore will slowly drain you of energy. Osra's cool response echoed, "How do I revert to a lower growth stage?" he asked quickly, feeling the rocky cave ceiling shift slightly. He was exuding a huge amount of pressure on it. If it collapsed, Simply focus on your current stage and will yourself to revert. Your soul spell matrix will follow your commands. Dorian paused, and then put his focus on making his body small, willing himself to revert to the first growth stage of his current form. A moment later, a light in his eyes flashed, and Dorian felt his body shrink in on itself. It took only an instant, and he soon had the appearance of his previous form, the Mire Wormling. "Phew," he said aloud, stretching his back. He looked up at the ceiling, seeing a small layer of cracks on it. That doesn't seem like a good sign. He shrugged, and then quickly scampered out of the underground cave, just to be safe. As he exited, he pulled up his soul status, checking on his condition. Dorian, soul status, soul stage. Masterclass, early. Health. Perfect. Energy. 94%, draining at 1% per 47 seconds. There really is a significant drain in maintaining this form, he thought, rubbing his draconic chin. He stopped willing himself to be in the first stage, and felt his body automatically resume its now natural state. That of a 3-meter-tall Mire dragon. Hey, I reached the master class. Awesome, I jumped past sky class. Dragons are the best, he noticed after a moment, doing a little celebratory jig. The difference between classes were extremely important in the 30,000 worlds. For beasts that relied on their bloodlines to grow strong, this difference was a life or death statistic. The master class was a dividing line between beasts. A single master class beast could easily crush several sky class beasts. Among those that practiced magic, once your understanding of magic, and ability to use it, reached the master class, your soul would evolve an innate barrier to protect your body. For beasts with powerful bloodlines that naturally reached the master class, it was a bit different. Master class beasts evolved a certain level of intelligence, beyond that of regular beasts. Not enough to be fully aware in most cases, but enough to be able to sense and detect the aura of other beasts, and form coherent responses to them. The soul of a master class beast was much stronger than that of a sky class beast. The reason all the master and grandmaster class beasts had fled or hidden upon feeling the aura Dorian released was due to that. But the biggest difference between a master class and a sky class beast was a more subtle point. Muscle and bone density. In the 30,000 worlds, the stronger a being's soul, the more powerful a body the being could contain or handle. For wizards, this was apparent in the awe-inspiring spells they could unleash. For beasts that grew via their bloodline, this began to show itself as their physical body became increasingly more powerful. The cells in one's body began to condense, growing tougher and more tightly packed, increasing in number. The higher the class, the more and more apparent this was. An incredible amount of strength and power could be concentrated in a single physical form, supported by a powerful soul spell matrix. That was how the laws of this very different universe functioned. Warriors that weren't able to practice magic followed a similar route to that of beasts, growing their body forcibly through constant training and stimulation. While they wouldn't be able to reach the peaks that certain powerful bloodlines could, they could still reach extraordinary levels. Dorian felt at his body, feeling a strength in him that he hadn't felt before. He looked down at his now several-inch-long claws, tapping them together. Clink. The resounding echo was powerful, and felt threatening. He felt a strength in his body he hadn't felt before, as if he could casually smash an entire tree into wooden shrapnel with a casual blow. He had become far stronger. He then looked at the wings on his back, his eyes lightening up. Naturally, as if by instinct, Dorian stretched them out, feeling as if he had an extra pair of arms attached to his back. A cool breeze washed over his wings as they expanded, growing out several meters longer than his body. He frowned as he looked at this. As a student who studied aerospace engineering, he knew very well that a wingspan of this size could never support his 3-meter-tall body. "Asra, can Mire dragons fly?" he queried. A Mire dragon is one of the weaker draconic bloodlines, and is incapable of extended flight. Gliding and other forms of temporary flight are possible. Asra responded coolly. Dorian shrugged, accepting it as it was. His eyes gleamed, however, at the thought of obtaining a form that could soar through the skies. What human wouldn't dream of such a thing? As he came to terms with his body, he focused on the last mental notification his soul spell matrix had sent him. New ability gained. Ability. Lesser Emerald Flames, 1/3. Description. An ability unique to several draconic breeds. the ability to unleash powerful green flames that burn with abandon, particularly effective in melting metal. The flames are aspected to the being that released them, and cannot damage oneself. This ability grows in mastery. What exactly were abilities? According to Asra, abilities were a power unique to beasts with unique or powerful bloodlines. The bloodline of a beast, and their respective soul spell matrix, were inherently tied together for almost all creatures. Some creatures had unique abilities they gained due to the makeup of their blood and soul spell matrix. These abilities were very similar to magic spells. The source of each was identical, from one's soul spell matrix. Wizards, however, had to practice very hard to maintain their mastery of any specific spell, learning and understanding more about how magic worked. An ability, on the other hand, was completely natural to the being that held it. The complex symbols and energy used functioned automatically, meaning even the least intelligent beast could operate it. Some wizards had made it their life's work to uncover more about the abilities of beings that held them, to uncover the secrets of the universe. Asra didn't have any specific information on how they had progressed, but said that it was entirely possible for a wizard to mimic an ability, if you studied it and learned about it long enough. Asra, it says this ability grows in mastery? What specifically does that mean? He felt as if he could guess, but wanted to be certain. Some abilities are tied to the growth of your physical form. As you grow stronger, the ability will grow alongside you as your body and soul become able to handle its stronger and stronger form. The genie replied. He nodded. That was what he figured. The stronger his body, the more powerful abilities he'd be able to handle. As he took in his recent growth, Dorian made sure to not let down his guard, keeping a careful watch on the surrounding valley. He saw at least 100 of the once tall trees were bent or folded, the shockwave from earlier breaking them. He decided to take a few moments before he left, analyzing the past few minutes. He felt like an idiot. He'd been so excited upon obtaining that powerful aura, he'd thought he was invincible. After all, such a powerful aura should make any intelligent being flee in fear, right? The answer to that seemed to be a resounding no. Just because he had a trump card didn't mean it would always work. Relying upon that to save him was foolish. He'd let down his guard in a valley he knew was dangerous. Sure, it had seemed safe at the time, and he'd only had a single encounter with intelligent humans before, but that was no reason to leave himself open. Starting a fire in the wilderness created an obvious smoke trail. He'd started singing as he relaxed, feeling as if he was truly safe. He needed to remind himself that this was not Earth. He could not act like he was just a regular human out on some camping trip. Powerful creatures existed here, beings that could crush him like a bug. His eyes hardened as he nodded his head sharply. He was extremely lucky to have survived this time, and the odds of that happening a second time were slim. He would not let this mistake happen again. Dorian sighed, rubbing his head. Or, well, attempting to. His claws appeared to be much sharper than his scales, and he accidentally stabbed himself. At least his regeneration seemed to have bumped up slightly thanks to his upgrade, the wound closing up and starting to slowly heal. Why did all those humans and vampires try to attack him, anyway? Or, rather, try to capture him? Till the fight unfolded, none of them seemed to want to actually kill him. How did they even find him? His eyes flashed as he remembered that wizard that had seen his red salamander form. Perhaps he led them here? But what about the vampires? As Dorian was pondering this, trying to decide where to go from now, a flash of white light caught his eyes. He spun around, a snarl on his face as he readied himself to flight, his eyes glinting. Floating in the air before him was the transparent figure of an old man with a long, white beard. "Excuse me, young dragon. Could I have a moment of your time?" The elderly man's voice was calm and soothing as he held his hands out, standing still and not moving. Hundreds of miles away, Lord Hadrian of the Black Lightning Department was gazing in Dorian's direction, a small frown on his face. He stood upon the southern wall of the great capital city Obsidia, looking out at the world around him. The enormous river bordered the city off to the east, while a large, relaxing grass plain flowed in other directions. "What do you reckon that was, Lara?" he said, motioning to the distance. A large, gleaming pillar of lightning had shot into the sky, attracting his attention just moments ago. This pillar held a very large amount of natural energy within it, enough for him to notice it, even at such a distance. Lara Consta, his Grandmaster class Fate Wizard companion, shrugged, her plain face devoid of emotion as she responded. I am not certain, but it almost certainly has to do with one of our own. I'll look into it. We should have a few of my wizards in the area. The woman sat down, directly on the outer stone wall of the city, her hands waving out in front of her. Light seemed to glow from her eyes as she focused, concentrating. As the leading member of the Department of Fate among all the Fate wizards that had come with them, Lara was the absolute leader among them. She had a unique grasp of Fate magic that was at the peak of the Grandmaster class. Fate magic was an incredibly obscure type of magic, but also one of the most useful. Any qualified group or team of wizards would have among them a wizard studying Fate magic, without fail. It was part of why the Fate Department was one of the largest and most widespread of the 108 departments, having members on teams with every single other department. Hadrian stared at the lightning as it fizzled out, his eyes calm. That was definitely a spell of some sort, and had a very strong resemblance to the lightning magic, Requiem above. He sighed. Time was running out, unfortunately. They probably didn't even have a full day before members from the Darkness Department and Sundering Department arrived. The headquarters of the Black Lightning Department was on a planet close to this outer world, but so too were the headquarters for the Darkness Department and Sundering Department. If he could successfully capture whatever caused the disturbance in Fate here on his own, he'd gain a very large amount of merit within his department, and subsequently be heavily rewarded. Unfortunately, Fate magic, even for the best Fate wizards, could be a damned difficult thing to unfold. They'd managed to pinpoint the disturbance in Fate to somewhere within 1,000 miles of here, but the exact location was elusive. He'd already spread his men out as far and wide as they could go, but had yet to find anything. The bright beam of lightning magic to the west, however, was incredibly intriguing. I've established a connection through Fate with one of our own in the area. They've found the location of the disturbance in Fate. Lara's voice contained, for once, a hint of excitement. Hadrian smiled, clenching his fists. It seemed they wouldn't be too late after all. Lara's next words, however, cooled his enthusiasm. It's apparently at least a Lord-class beast, and a very powerful one. She continued, and then stopped, stuttering. Hadrian turned his head, waving for her to continue. What manner of beast is it? He frowned gruffly. A powerful Lord-class beast. That could prove troublesome, especially if it was at the peak of strength. His last battle with a Lord-class beast had been an extremely tough one that wiped out an entire mountain range, and that beast hadn't been one at the peak of Lord-class. It appears to be a green-scaled baby dragon that likes to sing and dance? Chapter 17. An offer. Yes, I know, Commander Lara. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that is what we saw. Oblong squeezed his head, trying to ignore a massive headache as he spoke aloud. He was currently sitting atop one of Royal Wizard Iman's floating spatial boats. I don't know why it was dancing, it just was. I didn't recognize the Langu. Yes, Commander Lara. After getting far enough away from that monstrous tiny dragon, Aman had opted to summon one of his spatial vessels, helping them quickly retreat towards your city. The last they heard of that dragon and the vampires was the female vampire's agonized scream. Oblong had shaken his head then, feeling for her despite them being enemies. Her own arrogance had led to her death. At least they had managed to escape in time. White light was glowing out of his eyes as he spoke, a few mystical symbols floating in the air around him. He was currently using one of the most widely known Fate magic spells, Fate Magic, Fate Connection. The spell allowed two beings to temporarily connect to each other, hearing and seeing what the other person was seeing and hearing. It wasn't a full connection, and either party could limit the effectiveness of it, but the spell was still extremely useful. It allowed for the transportation of information across thousands of miles. The spell functioned oddly on the world bridges, but worked perfectly fine on any normal planet. Yes, Commander, yes. He ducked his head by instinct, waving his hands. Lara was not someone you wanted to cross, and he had no intention of angering her. We will await you in your city. He sighed as the connection ended. Lara had alerted him, and most likely every Fate wizard in the vicinity, trying to find out what was going on thanks to Graxatel's spell. He'd lost a chance to make a solid impression on Lord Hadrian, something that was truly unfortunate. Still, he'd only been working with this team for a very brief time, having encountered the group of Black Lightning wizards on Messer. A Lord-class Titan, one that was studying magic, suspected of being a double agent for the Graal Alliance, had been discovered on Messer. Oblong hadn't exactly been sure of the details, but he had witnessed the overwhelming might that Lord Hadrian held. The man had single-handed wiped more than a dozen mountains off the map with a single spell, and eventually obliterated the rogue Titan, a former member of the Sundering Department of the 108 Magic Departments. His potential as the rising star of the Black Lightning Department was massive. He sighed again. What was done was done. He'd have another chance in the future. He glanced over at the unconscious Graxital, baring his teeth at the man in annoyance. He then turned to look at the various warriors, many of them injured. Some had taken out medical supplies they'd brought with them, while others had taken in healing pills or medicines. As his eyes landed on the warriors sent from the Roble family, noting that they seemed huddled together in depression, he abruptly remembered their other companion, the wood wizard William Roble. After the wizard had been hit by one of the vampire's spells, he'd lost track of him. It seemed the man had fallen, unable to defend himself properly. Well, he thought, shrugging, they had made contact with the disturbance in fate now, so it didn't matter too much. While the reverberations he could detect with his fate magic were getting lesser and lesser, he should still be able to track down the beast just with himself. He went back to musing about the future, trying to think of a new way to curry Lord Hadrian's favor, the lost wizard long forgotten. "Who are you?" Dorian spat out, his body tense. The odd, floating old man gave off a very faint, golden and white light, but didn't emanate any dangerous aura, as far as he could tell. "Osra, what is this?" he queried immediately, not waiting for the ghostly figure to respond. "It appears to be a construct of magic, a soul, and a soul spell matrix, formed after the death of a powerful wizard. You are unable to absorb it. It appears to be minutes, perhaps hours, from dissipation, and is unable to harm you." Osra's response came instantly, drawing from the veritable encyclopedia of knowledge placed in his soul spell matrix. "My name is Horhavel Kandor, a former member of the Kandor clan of the Elector Empire." The old man began, giving Dorian a nod. "Oh," Dorian yelped out, recognizing the name. It was the same as the one from the ring he'd found. It should be the same unless the ghost was lying to him, but for it to appear here where the wizard died. He was convinced it was the real deal. The man looked at him quizzically. "Greetings, esteemed wizard," Dorian began, his voice respectful. Being polite cost him nothing, and while Osra said this wizard couldn't hurt him, he decided to be more careful. He couldn't afford to make more mistakes. "You know of me?" Horhavel asked, raising his eyebrows. The dragon's reaction to hearing his name had been quite odd. "I found a ring of yours a short while ago, and have heard of your plight." He spoke carefully, choosing his words. The wizard's eyes lit up with pleasure. "Ah, you found one of the saint rings I made? Do you still have it with you?" The elderly man queried. "No," Dorian responded, shaking his head. When he absorbed the energy left in it, it had fallen to pieces. Well, it is immaterial anyway." The elderly wizard shrugged, an odd-looking action for such a ghostly being. "What can I do for you?" Dorian asked, studying the Horhavel. He seemed to hover around a foot off the ground, his feet floating above the dirt. A ball of golden light was visible through his transparent figure near his stomach, shining dimly. "I wanted to ask a small favor of you, young dragon." The elderly man began, bowing his head. "I am not long for this world, unfortunately. Today will be the final day of my passing. I originally awoke upon feeling you unleash an aura extremely similar to my own, believing it to be a successor sent by my clan. Alas, my mistake," he continued, sighing. "Over there, under a pair of branches, lies a young wizard that is mortally wounded. While our styles are not exactly matching, he is the only wizard nearby. I have decided to make him my successor, so that my style of magic, and the knowledge within it, may be passed on." Horhavel paused, waving his ghostly hands off to the side. Dorian looked, seeing a pile of branches unnaturally grown from the ground, growing with a pale light. "I'm sorry you were awoken early. However, that wizard's fate is his own. What favor would you ask of me?" he questioned, his voice calm. He didn't mean to sound cruel, but he knew nothing about medicine and couldn't help someone that was mortally wounded. In addition, he was certain the dying wizard was one of those that had been with the group trying to capture him. He had noticed one of the wizards, the one that had seen his red salamander form, get hit and knocked away in the previous battle. He assumed it was him. There wasn't much of a reason he would want to save someone that just tried to kill or capture him. His eyes hardened at the thought. He couldn't afford to be the nice guy from Earth anymore. His heart wavered, however. Dragons, such as yourself, have remarkably vibrant bloodlines. The spell that young wizard is using is a decent healing spell, but one that lacks essence. If you were to give up a portion of your blood, spreading it upon the branches, the spell would increase in efficiency, enough to save his life. Your blood would replenish as normal, and you would remain unharmed. Horhavel responded, and then continued. I would not ask this of you for nothing. If you agree to help me save my successor, I will give to you a large store of magic herbs I possess, one of the few treasures I hid away before my death. There are nearly 200 magic herbs in that spatial pouch, many of them quite powerful, that should be of great use to you, even with your odd style of growth. Magic herbs were a resource that powerful beasts relied upon to grow. The stronger a creature got, the harder it was to increase in strength. This was especially so for beasts in the Master class and Grandmaster class. It went without saying that any amount of growth for incredibly rare Lord class or King class beasts was even harder. Magic herbs spawned naturally throughout the world, one of the natural laws of this universe. Greater numbers of them could be found in locations that were left to the wild, though the exact reasons for this had yet to be fully understood. Not all magic herbs were made equal. Some contained enormous amounts of energy, some had energy aspected towards a certain element, some even had intelligence. For a normal or even a genius dragon of Dorian's current growth, this would be an extremely valuable reward, even if all the magic herbs were of the worst type. Dorian, however, maintained a strict poker face, aided by the fact that he didn't know how to properly display emotions on his current visage. The fact that he had grown from a baby drake to a young adult in just minutes had been seen through by the wizard, unfortunately, but he didn't seem to make any other comment on it. Magic herbs like that are useful, but if you are bestowing your knowledge of magic upon someone, why not do that for both of us? You can give you magic herbs to your successor, I'll take that as my reward. Dorian's eye flashed as he envisioned himself casting spells left and right. The floating spirit shook his head. Young Drake, if that was possible I would consider that option. Unfortunately, I am unable to fulfill it. To transfer my knowledge to another being requires me to sacrifice what is left of my essence, essentially killing me. It is not something I can do twice. The man continued. Further, your soul would most likely be unable to accept my inheritance. From what I can sense, you have never studied magic, and have yet to experience any baptism of the soul related to magic. My inheritance would simply flush off your soul, unable to take root. Dorian frowned when he heard this, not giving up. My soul is unique, as far as souls and soul spell matrices go. How can you be certain? Horhavel paused, and then stared at him closely. While you were undergoing that odd growth session of yours underground, I took the time to communicate with the injured wizard. He said slowly, his eyes studying Dorian. I was made aware that you are at the center of a great investigation, into a being that has disturbed fate. The old man stroked his long, trailing white beard. His eyes grew slightly unfocused as he looked at Dorian, and then seemed to look through him. And now that I look at you closely, I can sense that your soul is indeed unique. Though my field of study was not closely related to fate, after reaching near the peak of the Tao of Light, I came to possess a vision of the world that was expansive, letting me see through things. In addition, while I am in this form, the souls of other beings have become very clear to me. He waved his hands at himself. I am no fate expert, but I can tell that fate seems to be twisted around you. People and events will be drawn to you, for inexplicable reasons. Odd things may happen around you, and even chance itself may become twisted. This meeting between us is probably a result of that. He shook his head here. However, that does not mean your soul is a suitable one for my inheritance. While there are definitely unique aspects surrounding it, you still have yet to receive even the most basic baptism from the laws of the universe in regards to magic. Without that, it is impossible for my inheritance to take root. Dorian frowned. Asra, can I learn magic? He asked a general question that he'd thought of before, but never actually asked. Yes, though the host's current physical form and soul are somewhat unsuited for it. With the absorption of bloodlines of beings that are aspected or skilled in magic, understanding and implementing magic will become easier, though your soul will need to undergo baptism of the laws of this universe like any other wizard. Asra's voice replied coolly in his head. He frowned again. It seemed he could learn magic, but not as he was yet. He wasn't willing to let this old mage know about his unique abilities, and it didn't seem like he would have any chance right now to find a suitable form. Do you have any magical artifacts or tools, or treasures that contain magical energy? He asked, taking a different approach. He could only eat a single magic herb a day, so the growth he could gain from that, while significant, would take time. The old man rubbed his chin, responding, "Much of what I used came purely from my own magic. I do have a few old treasures that contain magic energy, but nothing significant. Most wizards do not heavily rely upon external objects, save for spells involving multiple casters." The ghostly wizard seemed to notice that Dorian was pulling back, and hurriedly offered. "While I don't have any particular treasures, I do know the location of a huge store of treasure on my home planet." He gave Dorian a smile. "There are veritable mountains of treasures with magic energy in them there. Should you agree to help my successor here, I will send over the specific information on where and what that location is, alongside the roughly 200 magic herbs I still have stored." Dorian's eyes lit up in excitement, considering it carefully. All he needed to give up was some blood, and he'd receive a large reward immediately, as well as the potential for a large reward later. As long as he remained on guard and treated this carefully, he didn't see any downsides. As for that wizard being his enemy, he was a master-class dragon now. He wasn't afraid of him, and he was already planning on fleeing here as soon as he wrapped this up. "All right, give me the magic herbs first, and you have yourself a deal, old man." Thousands of miles away, a ragged-looking pair could be seen, boarding a large caravan. Hundreds of huge wagons, of all shapes and sizes, could be seen, some made of odd metals, others made of wood. These wagons were currently leaving through the main gate of a very large city in the Tandoor Empire, one of the 3 large empires on the planet of Hosnorth, Yum City. The city was famed for its beautiful roofs and roads, created from many different types of colored clay. "Just keep it together, Gaia," Brutus muttered, his voice filled with concern as he looked at his pale-faced companion. Gaia lay resting inside one of these caravans' private rooms, still unconscious. Her body looked peaceful, but haggard, with light fluttering behind her eyes. He turned to look out a window towards the front of the caravan. Towards what was in front of it, a massive world bridge, more than 60 miles wide, where huge grassy plains spread across a savanna teeming with life. "We're almost off-world, Gaia," he said, his eyes clouded. "Just one more week and we can get you help, and inform the High Lord." Chapter 18. Necessities. The branches were a mix of pale white and warm brown, spread out in a small, cocoon shape. They seemed to have risen directly from the ground and gave off a very faint, warm aura. A pair of cracked trees stood next to them, broken bark dangling. Dorian studied them as he stood next to the pile, his eyes curious. Tied around his neck with a piece of thick, magic-enhanced leather, was a small spatial pouch, one of the most useful magic artifacts in the 30,000 worlds. Created by wizards who studied a branch of space magic, the pouch contained a space for storage far larger than its outside appearance. This particular one was a very high-class one, with well over 30 meters of storage space. In the pouch were a veritable plethora of magic herbs, so many that the sense of them almost overwhelmed Dorian's mind when he opened the pouch. He used a very tiny amount of energy from his soul spell matrix to form a connection with the pouch, allowing him to access it. "How much blood do I need to spill?" he asked aloud, turning to look at the ghostly figure. The dead wizard seemed a bit fainter than he had before. After Horhavel had agreed with Dorian on their deal, he'd waved his hands together, pulling a spatial pouch out of thin air somehow. The act of doing so, however, seemed to weaken him. He would give Dorian the details to the hidden stash of treasure after he helped the dying wizard. Enough to cover the branches, and set the light they give off to a red tinge. It shouldn't be too trying. The elderly man's voice was calm and placid, as if he was ordering a meal at a restaurant. Dorian looked down at his body, his green scales glistening brightly in the mid-morning light. He then stepped forward till he was hovering over the tree branches. "Very well," he said, and stabbed a claw into the side of his chest, pulling it down. He winced in pain as blood began to spill from the wound. His pain tolerance seemed to have jumped immensely after coming to this world because despite how acute his senses were, and how aware he was of the injury, he only felt a faint sense of worry. Beings with a master-class physical form have decently strong natural regenerative abilities. Dragons, even Meyer dragons, a lesser offshoot, have very strong regenerative properties. These combined meant that his injury was already attempting to scab over, just seconds after he made the cut. Dorian frowned when he saw this, cutting himself again, and this time forcing his blood to spatter over the tree branches. Several seconds passed as he watched, dispassionately, as the branches gradually took on a reddish tint. Soon they began to emit a very faint, crimson glow. As soon as he saw this, Dorian stepped back, allowing his injuries to start healing. He felt slightly lightheaded at the blood loss but was otherwise fine. The tree branches began to writhe, the red glow becoming stronger. They visibly grew thicker, worming and writhing in unnatural, faintly disturbing movements. As they writhed, gradually the figure of a human being came into view. A man with a slim, handsome face and piercing blue eyes, though a face that was now quite pale. He appeared to be unconscious. Gradually his head and shoulders appeared above the branches before stopping, the healing magic continuing to work on the other injured parts of his body. "My deepest thanks, young dragon." The old man's voice echoed in Dorian's ears as the man floated forward, looking down at the tree branch cocoon. His body seemed to be shifting, pieces of it drifting off. The man turned to look at Dorian and then raised a hand to his head, tapping it with a finger. Instantly an inch-wide ball of light appeared. He gave a smooth bow. "This contains the information I have of the ruins in the Ember Gorge. This stash of treasure will not be easy to claim, but for someone of your capabilities, you should be able to handle it. I discovered it just a few years before my death, finding several clues I needed in my journey to reach ascension." Alas, Horhavel's voice was tired as he spoke, regret filling his voice. "Osra, what is it?" he asked, just to be safe. The old man hadn't lied to him yet, but it was better to be safe. "A small orb of energy and essence, extracted from a soul in the midst of dissipation. Something like this would be used in the transfer of information or memories." Osra's voice in his mind confirmed that it was what it was. Dorian accepted the orb, letting it float into his hand. As soon as he did, he felt a flood of information pour into his mind. Information about a mysterious mountain range and a large canyon, fraught with peril and danger, on another world. He pushed that aside for the moment, however, focusing on what was happening in front of him. "Ah, young wizard," the old man began, looking down at the wooden branches, his voice filled with sorrow. "I wish I could stay longer, to talk with you more. Alas, my soul is but minutes from perishing. From life to life, from death to death, the cycle continues, unabated." The ghostly old man folded his hands together. Gradually, the golden ball of light that floated at the center of his body began to crack, minuscule particles floating off into the air. These particles slowly formed into a writhing river, flowing towards the head of the unconscious wizard. Dorian watched it all with interest. The process went on smoothly, the golden ball of light gradually growing smaller and smaller. Abruptly, however, the body of the injured wizard began to shake, his mouth twitching. Odd noises emerged from his throat, keening echoes. "No." The old man's voice was weak as he yelled out, his eyes widening. "What's happening?" Dorian stepped forward, his eyes alert. At his core, Dorian tried to be a good person. His father, back on Earth, had always told him that the most important choices you made were the ones that no one would be there to see. Maybe he couldn't be the same easygoing nice guy from Earth anymore, but that didn't mean he would abandon his moral standards. Since he had already committed to helping, and found out it was possible to help at all, he would go all the way. That was simply who he was, regardless of whether or not it would be the decision that benefited him most. His soul is serving as a receptacle, and taking in the root of my experience and knowledge. His body, however, is rejecting the magic and changes, causing him to undergo discordancy, a rejection between the body and soul. Horhavel quickly explained, staring at the trembling wizard. His soul has been baptized with the laws of magic several times, but his body isn't recognizing that my inheritance isn't an attack, and is actively resisting. The ghostly wizard seemed to wring his hands, an odd sight. "Do you want me to try and knock him unconscious?" Dorian asked. Perhaps if the man was forced to be completely unconscious, it would force his body to accept the change. If his body does not calm down and accept the changes, he will die. Physically forcing him into unconsciousness like that would disturb his mind. The old man's voice was quiet and small as he sighed to himself. Alas! He shook his head slowly, his eyes cast downward. Gradually, the particles around him began to tremble, as if he was about to truly vanish. Dorian looked at the situation and frowned. An idea abruptly came into his head. He realized he had a way to resolve this. But the sheer coincidence of his method caught him off guard for a moment. I twist fate with my soul now, Is this a part of that too? He said aloud as he stepped forward, still frowning. The old wizard that was about to dissipate paused, watching Dorian in confusion. I have an idea that might work. You said physically knocking him out won't cut it, right? Dorian responded, turning to glance at the elderly wizard. The wizard simply nodded. What if I use a calming sedative? In Dorian's mind a message popped up. Brown treasure clam. Growth stage 2 halves, venom. Stored amount. 63 milliliters. The venom he had stored several days ago was from a mystical creature with unique ties to fate. Further, it was a type of venom that acted as a sedative. There wasn't much of it, so it would only last for a few brief minutes at most, but it should be enough. Dorian willed this venom to appear, following the instructions Asra had told him about it. Gradually, his claws began to take on a sheen, tipped with the sedative. Yes, that could work, young dragon. The old wizard clapped his hands together, his form that appeared to be on the brink of vanishing all of a sudden gaining new vibrancy. Quickly please. Haste appeared in the fading old man's voice as he motioned, almost begging. Dorian stepped forward and carefully placed his claws at the neck of the shaking man, trying to not accidentally stab him. Ever so slightly, he pierced the skin of the man's neck lightly, drawing a small line of blood. At the same time, he felt the venom in his claws flow forward, into the man. It vanished in an instant, fully absorbed. A few seconds later, the man calmed down, his body returning back to normal. As this happened, the golden river of light particles continued to flow into his head, smoothly and without error. As Dorian stepped back, he heard a grateful voice call out. Young dragon, I cannot thank you enough. If I had more treasures to give, I would. All I have left are insubstantial things. The rest was destroyed or taken from my body. The floating old man looked at him with eyes glinting brightly. Dorian shook his head, saying simply, It's fine. It was the right thing to do. A silent moment passed between them, and then another. Soon that moment became a minute, and then two. Eventually, the river of golden particles finished flowing into the resting man, and all was done. The fading figure of the old wizard studied him one last time. As I pass from this world, let me give you one last gift, as my last thanks to you. The man's voice began to fade, becoming quieter than a whisper. The reverberations in fate your soul gives off will fade, gradually, in a week or two. I can help you hide them for a day, maybe two. The rest is up to you, young dragon. Good fortune to you, and may the cycle continue, unabated. A few, faint white particles drifted and landed on Dorian. He shivered, feeling as if he had been dunked in a vat of cold water. He blinked, and the instant later, as he opened his eyes, he realized he was alone. The figure of that old mage was gone. So goes the last of the wizard Horhavel Candor. Dorian muttered quietly, bowing his head silently in respect. After a few moments, he turned, looking down at the young-looking wizard who was just now coming awake. Ah! William Roble felt horrible. His head felt cramped and crowded, full of pain. His body felt as if it had been dragged alongside a wagon for days, beaten and bruised. His only consolation was the warm, flowing feeling he felt, wrapping around his injured form, healing him. He came to gradually. As he did, the memories of the past day rushed into his tired mind. The battle for that odd, dancing dragon, the vicious attack he had suffered from those vile vampires, and now his apparent abandonment by the department wizards, and even his own family guards. He had no memory of what happened after he was injured, smacked back by the attack, but he was almost certain that they had thrown him aside and fled. Those vampires seemed like bad news. He wasn't sure if even that black lightning wizard could handle them. He bared his teeth and clenched his fists, feeling humiliated and angry. At least he was still alive, however. After a few seconds, he managed to blink, and slowly opened his eyes. The bright light of day blinded him as he looked around. Almost immediately his heart dropped as he saw a hulking, 3-meter-tall dragon standing right in front of him. Ah! Involuntarily, he let out a scream. As he did so, another rush of memories came into his mind. Memories of an odd conversation with a strange old man, a man who talked to him about giving him an inheritance of magic. He abruptly realized that this conversation was one that had actually happened as he felt at his soul. In his soul, the orb of white light that represented him and his soul spell matrix, William could feel what appeared to be a second soul spell matrix, floating next to his own. This matrix, however, was merely a pale copy, a poor comparison, to his original one. Still, within this matrix, he could sense a vast store of memories and experiences, from a wizened, kindly old man. Tears began to stream down his face as he realized what the elderly wizard had done for him. Giving someone an inheritance like this was supposed to be an intimately sacred ritual, reserved for your closest kin. To give up an inheritance to a complete stranger like him, it was practically unheard of. Mentally, he made a promise that he would not waste it. He would give up his mediocre wood magic, and immediately train the old man's, no, the esteemed, Horhavel Cander's, light magic. As these memories continued to come into him, he realized that the dragon in front of him had helped save his life. He'd managed to regain some of his consciousness after some time in his healing spell, and had overheard their conversation. And, he realized, despite its hulking form, that it was somehow the same as the small dragon they had tried to capture, and failed to, before. He looked up in confusion, not understanding. What exactly had happened after he fell unconscious? How much time had passed? Hello, he sputtered out. As he spoke, he realized he couldn't move yet. He winced as he tried to, feeling his body shake in pain. The healing spell he had cast earlier was still active, though now flowing with a vibrant, full power that he couldn't replicate. The part the dragon had given to help save his life. You should stay still for now. You're still healing. The dragon's voice was smooth and sibilant, full of strong, powerful confidence. William shivered as he heard it, glancing at the beautiful green scales on the drake. He noticed a small, still healing scar on the head of the dragon, oddly in the shape of one of the dragon's claws, as if it had stabbed itself. He shook the thought from his head, however, knowing no dragon would be so foolish. William was a mess of emotions as he stared up at the dragon. Anger and hurt at being abandoned by his companions, joy and surprise at still being alive, thankfulness and happiness at having been given an inheritance. The fear he felt faded away as he looked at the beast, just wanting to know one thing. Why did you save me? The rewards that wizard offered, you and I both know they would be worth little to a dragon like yourself. Magic herbs thrive in these mountains, and even if he has some extremely rare ones, it shouldn't be too big a difference. His voice carried a strange passion, full of emotion. This was something he needed to know. He didn't know why, he just knew he needed to know this, even if it cost him his life. He felt oddly compelled. Dorian shrugged as he looked down at the injured human, thinking his question over and responding. I guess because it felt like the right thing to do. If he could do something to help, he would. Maybe if he thought his actions would achieve nothing, he wouldn't have tried to save the wizard. But knowing that he could. Besides, the reward wasn't as small as the injured wizard was making it out to be. Having around 200 magic herbs stored with him was definitely substantially useful for when he left this area, and the information on that treasure stash was extremely alluring. Also, there was a chance he could gain information about the men tracking him from the injured man, and about the world around him. What? The wizard below him struggled in shock, his face flushing. I'm your enemy. I tried to capture you. I even helped lead them to you. As the wizard spoke, his voice's pitch went up, sputtering. If you were smart, you would kill me right now. How do you know I won't lead them to you again? Dorian caught an odd tone in the man's voice, one that made him choose his response carefully. Dorian looked at the still healing wizard, taking a moment to think. It was true. This was a brutal world. It was kill or be killed. By leaving this man alive, he might be bringing himself problems in the future. The smart thing to do would be to kill him, here and now, and silence this issue. He could even absorb his bloodline and create a human body if he so chose. Maybe somehow steal that inheritance, even without receiving whatever magic soul baptism the wizard said he needed. There was a chance, anyway. But, would he regret doing that? As the thought touched his mind, he felt himself come to a certain inner peace. He had decided he would live without regrets in this world. It wasn't the wisest or most logical decision to let this wizard go. Perhaps it was even a mistake. In his red salamander form, the wizard had tried to attack him, thinking he was just a stray wild beast. In his draconic form, he had tried to capture him. At the least, they weren't on friendly terms. Despite that, Dorian felt like the man wasn't a bad type. Maybe others would call him a fool for this, but he didn't care. "I don't know that you won't lead them to me," Dorian began, shaking his head, his eyes glinting. "But I will live how I choose to live, and not a damn thing in this universe will change that. Maybe I don't have the strength, right now, to back those words up." His mind went to his father, the greatest man he knew, and what he would do in a situation like this. "But one day I will. What kind of huma ahem, what kind of dragon would I be, if I didn't live up to what I believed in?" He looked down at the young wizard, and then smiled. "I'm a dragon with principles, after all." He smiled wider. But, the wizard sputtered at him in disbelief. "No buts." Dorian's eyes lit up as inspiration struck. "Life is about the bare necessities, young wizard," he said, nodding his head sagely, "the simple bare necessities. Just forget about your worries and your strife. Now, enough of that. Before we part ways here, would you mind answering a few questions I have about this world?" Chapter 19. Taking Flight. Dorian looked out over the steep cliff he was on and at the thriving forest below. Thousands of great oak trees spread out, creating a dense, brilliant canopy, like an ocean of leaves rocking gently at sea. After talking with William, the wizard he met, for several minutes, they had parted ways. The human had shared a great amount of information about this world, and about those that were chasing them. He'd also given the wizard some life advice his dad and Google had given him, from back on Earth, once he learned about the poor guy's situation. Dorian took everything the wizard told him with a grain of salt, though, just to be safe. He didn't think the wizard was lying, but it was better to be cautious. "Asra, you said I can merge bloodlines, right?" he queried, asking the calm genie. "After completing a growth cycle for any creature form and fully growing its bloodline, you can merge that bloodline with any other grown bloodline, or any group of others, to create a hybrid creature. Hybrid creatures may not necessarily be stronger than the base forms. An infinite number of hybrid forms are possible, and most of them I have no data on." Asra's response in his head was clear. He nodded, considering his plans. Mire Dragon. Growth stage, 2/4, Mire Young Adult. Growth progress 1302 8620ths. He was making progress on his Mire Dragon form again, albeit slowly. He wasn't sure how his progress had increased the amount it did, but guessed it had something to do with the now dead wizard's last gift to him. He was a master-class beast now, and he could feel the strength in his body. However, there were Grandmaster-class beasts in these mountains, and he'd needed to pick his path carefully. According to William, this entire universe was more complex than he originally thought. Asra had made him aware that there were an enormous number of worlds in this universe, and that a multitude of creatures and beasts among them. He now knew, however, that these worlds were connected by enormous strips of land called world bridges. These bridges were literally bridges between worlds, but massive in scale, where even the smallest stretched more than 24 miles in width, and hundreds of miles in length. There were 3 world bridges connecting to this world. The best way to escape his pursuers would be to get on one of these world bridges. Apparently he was being tracked through fate magic, some type of mystical art that he didn't quite understand. Fate magic operated weirdly on the world bridges, as did several other types of magic, due to the spatial interference and distorted laws that surrounded world bridges, allowing them to exist. If he could make it to one of the world bridges, his chances of escaping would greatly increase. The closest world bridge led to a planet known as Messer, notably one of the longest world bridges in the 30,000 worlds. Dorian had automatically stricken that one from the list, because, according to William, the wizards searching for him had most likely come from that world bridge, and were concentrated in that area. Instead, he decided, his eyes turned to the south, it would be better to take the world bridge found within the Tandoor Empire. Specifically, the one located outside the city of 1,000 colors, Yum City. The Tandoor Empire was far from where he was. Easily 1,000 miles. Even for his draconic, master-class body, that was a journey that would take some time. He couldn't even see the mythical world bridge that existed, though he was excited to have his first glance at it. The world bridge there led to a planet known as Taprisha. It was a planet that acted as a buffer zone between one of the three vampire families and the Boral autarky. It also just so happened that one of the world bridges that existed on Taprisha went in the direction of the planet that the fallen wizard Horhavel had said contained the Ember Gorge and the huge treasure stash he'd found. The wizard had left a small map of the worlds close to it in that information orb, and Taprisha was one of them, albeit one of the farthest away. Dorian smiled, his eyes shining. He needed power, right now, strength to stand by upright and proud. And he had a plan to get it. With that thought resounding in his head, he began to run forward, towards the edge of the cliff that overlooked the forest, roughly 200 meters below. With a yell, Dorian threw himself in the air, his emerald wings shining in the mid-afternoon light, and began to glide high above the forests below. William rubbed his eyes, moving carefully through the undergrowth. He stepped gingerly, his body still recovering from the shock of the wounds he'd received earlier and then forcibly healed. A wooden sword floated in the air next to him, the spell Wood Magic, Armory applied. It was a simple, self-defense spell designed to deal with anything that would try to attack him. He had just managed to leave the dangerous mountain region, and entered the forests just to the south of your city, making his way back. Once he got a little farther from the mountains, he planned on summoning his flying ark to soar back home. His mind was aflutter, right now, with a million thoughts. That dragon had stayed true to its word, letting him go without trying to harm him, or even blackmail him. Such a behavior was so atypical to anything he expected, it was foreign to him. Something the dragon had told him resounded in his ears. He'd been answering several of the Drake's questions about the world he lived on, Hosnorth. Many of them were simple questions, like what lay in which direction, while others were more complex, asking about the people or beings in power, or the wizards that were hunting him. At one point, William had brought up his own family and his issues with them. He hadn't planned on it, but the conversation had somehow leaned that way. When the dragon learned of how he was a bastard, and hated his father, and of his victory in proving his strength, it had given him an odd look. If you hate them so much, why do you care about proving anything to them? The young Drake's voice had cut to his soul then, its point echoing in his mind. Don't depend on others for happiness. Look for it within yourself. He'd been stunned, unable to give a reply. Their conversation had quickly moved on past that, but the words the dragon shared had stuck with him. In a way, it was true that he hated his father. He'd never met his mother, a maid that had left shortly after giving birth to him. He'd tried searching for her to no avail, even when he hired a fate wizard. There was no one in his family he was particularly close to. Even his grandfather and great-uncle only cared for him because he had clawed his way up to gaining a decent amount of strength as a sky-class wizard. He had a few friends he'd made, some mercenaries and warriors he'd hire and knew on a first-name basis. But no lover, no one close. Wizards had longer lifespans than those that practiced magic, especially depending on the higher class you reached. But that was no excuse for wasting your life. What am I trying to do here? He muttered, rubbing his chin. He cast the thought from his mind, however, as he focused, clasping his hands together. Wood magic. Genova's flying ark. An instant after he finished speaking, a mysterious cluster of symbols appeared in front of him. A collection of wood burst forth from this cluster, bending and stretching, twisting into the shape of a mid-sized ship. It stood around 20 meters long, and a dozen meters wide, built entirely out of a dark brown wood. A large pillar rose from the middle of the boat, an empty mast. A small cabin could be seen on one end of the boat, leading towards the inside. It was one of his most prized spells, a complex one he'd only managed to learn after reaching the sky class. Let's get home, for now, he muttered, deciding he'd figure out his thoughts later. For now, he turned his mind to the other cluster of symbols in his soul. The inheritance left behind by that awe-inspiring light wizard. Your city. In a large, open courtyard, owned by the Roble family, a cohort of figures were currently standing around, talking. Oblong stood in front of the Roble family head in the midst of a discussion about the fallen wood wizard, giving him a small nod. My apologies, Garibaldi, he said, attempting to make his voice somber. Oblong's eyes were drawn out and exhausted, the stress of the day pulling on him. He barely had enough energy to stay awake, and wanted nothing more than to sleep. It's fine. The gaunt, elderly figure of the family head shook his head calmly, shrugging. It is William's fault that he wasn't capable enough. He had a decent amount of potential, but, as they say, when the blood is spoiled. He shrugged again. Oblong. Enough with the niceties. A plain-looking woman waltzed into the courtyard, followed by a few other fate wizards. At the end of the group calmly walked a man that made Oblong shiver. Lord Hadrian. A Lord-class wizard. He had long, wild black hair, with a muscular physical appearance. A strong chin and jaw complemented his rough smile, giving him a gruff look. Small black particles of energy seemed to flow around him, following him. The devastating aura that powerful beings could emit. Most Lord-class wizards had the capability to emit an aura, a physical manifestation of their strength and will. Hadrian practiced a particularly virulent type of magic, black lightning magic, however, and his aura was emitted even without him trying. Thankfully, only a minute portion of it spread, not enough to cause people to suffer. Still, it gave him an incredibly fierce appearance. One he well deserved. By Lord Hadrian's side was an elderly woman wearing a full, purple dress, with the insignia of the Obsidia River Empire emblazoned on it. One of the nation's royal wizards, the sole other one practicing space magic. Commander Lara, Lord Hadrian. Oblong turned and bowed as he saw the superiors he'd been waiting on. The royal wizard Aemon stepped forward, greeting the duo as well, and then turning to smile and warmly hug the other royal wizard. "Where is Graxital?" Lord Hadrian's voice was rough and enthralling, full of power. Oblong gulped as he heard it, but recovered smoothly and responded. "He is recovering inside. Unleashing his last spell took a lot out of him, and it will take him some days to recover." Lord Hadrian nodded when he heard this, and then glanced towards Lara at his side. The Fate Commander stepped forward immediately, taking charge. "Oblong, begin a foretelling immediately. We need to pinpoint the location of that dragon before it can move too far, and track it down." Her voice was stern, with no room for argument. Oblong didn't allow himself to sigh, simply nodding attentively. In front of Lord Hadrian, he could not afford to look bad. The fact that he had spoke to the dragon, as well as stood before it, meant he was the best choice to trace the reverberations in fate it was emitting. He shuddered anew, however, at the memory of the aura the beast gave off. He clasped his hands together, casting a formal spell. Fate magic. Foretelling. Wizards that studied fate magic had a unique understanding with fate. After many years of study, especially for those at the master class and above, a wizard could divine certain things even without casting spells. The formal spell, foretelling, was the staple of fate magic. It was a complex spell that allowed one to use the energy of existence to feel the connections of fate that existed all around. Countless, invisible threads weaving an enormous tapestry of life that connected all living beings. Making sense of the great tapestry of life was difficult even for the best fate wizards, but what could be gleaned was almost a ways useful. As Oblong cast his foretelling, focusing on the small dragon they had seen, his eyes began to glow a faint, white light. He felt his connection to the world, the wonderful, blissful feeling of gazing upon the limitless tapestry of life. He felt that the strings of fate connected to him, trying to sense one that contained reverberations in fate, created by unknown causes. Just as he was trying to center in on one, however, a blinding flash of light blasted into his eyes, knocking him out of his foretelling. He screamed out loud and fell to the ground, covering his eyes in pain. The rough, stone floor of the courtyard bruised his back and elbows, his innate barrier as a master-class wizard unable to absorb self-caused impacts. Everyone in the courtyard froze, staring at the obese fate wizard in astonishment. "My eyes." Oblong clutched at his eyes, feeling at them. 2 lines of blood dripped down his face, the area around his eyes light red and burnt. He refused to open them, and instead immediately forced himself past his pain, casting another spell. Fate magic. Fate reversal. He felt a large amount of energy in his body leave him. He would not be able to cast another spell today. Fate magic was not renowned for its healing spells. The only spell Oblong knew that could heal him was the spell Fate Reversal, which was similar to some time magic spells in that it reversed something that had happened to him. As the redness around his face began to recede, and his body began to heal, the pain that threatened to send him unconscious faded. The overwhelming tiredness he now felt, however, remained. He also set to trembling, his body in shock. What on earth was that? Commander Lara's voice broke the frozen silence, staring at Oblong in confusion. Oblong responded, his voice ragged and harried. The dragon appears to have some sort of protection applied to him from scrying fate. It didn't feel permanent, but I am unable to break through it, at least not right now. His eyes finished healing, fully restored to the condition they had been in before. What? We can't afford to wait, we don't. Commander Lara was cut off mid-sentence before she could continue. It's fine, Lara. Lord Hadrian's voice was cool, not showing a hint of displeasure. Any being that has a soul that twists fate itself is bound to be unusual. It's aware of us hunting it now. It's only natural that it will prepare safeguards. His eyes flashed as he spoke, a small smile appearing on his face. Oblong, you have worked hard. Would you care to become a permanent addition to my team? The man turned to look at Oblong, the small smile vanishing as his eyes turned completely serious. Excitement cut through his tired haze like lightning as he sat up, staring at the gruff wizard. It would be my pleasure, Lord Hadrian. Inside, he was yelling victoriously. This was perfect. Every fate wizard needed powerful companions to be paired up with. By standing at Lord Hadrian's side, it was almost guaranteed that he would be richly rewarded as time went on, and easily break through to the Grandmaster class. Good. You will rest up here with Graxital. The rest of us will move on for the target immediately. We have only hours, at best, till the teams from the Sundering and Darkness departments arrive. His voice was powerful and full of authority. He turned to look at Commander Lara, his eyes cold, continuing. Lara, cast a foretelling and see if you can find anything related to the dragon. Don't foretell directly about him, go about it in an indirect manner. I doubt it's shielded everything from us. Lara immediately nodded and set to work, settling in to cast her spell. Oblong retreated back inside the courtyard the Roble family had provided to them, falling asleep almost instantly inside a small bedroom. Fate magic. Greater foretelling. A spell only a Grandmaster class Fate wizard could cast. The spell required a huge amount of energy and concentration, something only a powerful soul could handle. Lara could only cast it once without taking a long time to rest. It was a more powerful version of a regular foretelling, but one that was more accurate and targeted. A tense silence followed as none of those present dared to talk, waiting for Lara to finish her spell. Hadrian watched all of it dispassionately, his appearance unconcerned. A few moments passed. Lara's eyes glowed as she spoke aloud, looking up from her spell, her voice filled with eagerness. I haven't found the disturbance, Lord Hadrian. But I've detected someone that might be able to help us find it, or at least provide a closer link. The plain-faced Fate wizard turned away from Hadrian to look at the Roble family head, an odd look in her glowing eyes. It seems your wood wizard descendant has managed to survive after all. Chapter 20. Hi. The air rushed against his wings like water flowing in a rapid river. Fast, rough, but at the same time somehow wonderful and beautiful. Unknown currents moving in different ways, pulling and tugging. Dorian laughed in exhilaration as he soared through the sky, looking down on the world below. The sea of leaves moved with the breeze, looking warm and comfortable in the calm afternoon light. Wow, his only thought was the sheer, amazing feeling of flying through the air. He wasn't truly flying, of course. He was merely gliding, using his wings to keep gravity at bay. Mire dragons weren't capable of full flight. He also hadn't dared to practice this in the mountains, where Grandmaster-class beasts ran amok. According to William, almost all Grandmaster-class beasts would live in either mountainous regions or special areas with a high concentration of magic herbs. The Nebra Mountains, as Dorian learned they were called, were a prime example of these mountainous regions. Forests, like the Thousand Oak Forest that not only surrounded the Nebra Mountains, but extended far to the south, were populated with dangerous beasts, but usually only at the limit of master class. Dorian had learned a bit more about the true divides between classes from William in their extended talk. While Osra had a massive amount of information in regards to the species of types of creatures, the genie wasn't very informed on the world itself. The reason Dorian hadn't seen any Lord-class beasts, the class above Grandmaster, was due to their extreme rarity. Lord-class beasts in the wild were an excessively uncommon occurrence. Almost all Lord-class beasts, in the 30,000 worlds, originated from intelligent clans. Lord-class black mire dragons, Lord-class torrent hydras. There existed several species that had the ability to grow into the Lord class, though reaching that class was not a guarantee, even with the correct bloodline. These clans tended to group together, and thus when a beast entered Lord class, they would do so within the clan, or lands controlled by said clan. The laws of this universe, according to Asra, made it so that it was possible, though rare, for a beast to mutate at birth into rare or powerful bloodlines that they possessed a trace of in their original bloodline. This seemed to happen more often when one lived in an area where magic herbs grew, one of the mysterious laws of existence. At least some of the Grandmaster class beasts Dorian had seen had most likely arisen as a result of this. A beast mutating and gaining a Lord class bloodline was theoretically possible, but extremely rare. This threw a bit of a wrench in Dorian's plans to grow stronger. If Lord class bloodlines were so rare, it was unlikely he'd be able to find even a trace of one in a common beast. It was possible he might find traces in stronger or more power Grandmaster beasts. But would that trace be enough to work with? Or would it be degraded like the Mire Dragon bloodline had been? It wasn't like he'd be able to hunt down herds of the same Grandmaster class beast, as far as he could tell. He'd never seen more than one of the same type of Grandmaster class beast. The stronger your class or bloodline, the more difficult it was to conceive a child. It was possible he might be able to find a beast that had a mate of the same race, but a whole family? Some Grandmaster beasts possessed a semblance of intelligence and some even truly were self-aware and intelligent, though none he had seen thus far. He drew the line at hunting down a creature like that, even if it was for the sake of growing stronger. If he was attacked, then he would defend himself and go from there, but otherwise. Dorian cast these thoughts from his mind as he focused on his gliding, soaring forward. He strained the muscles in his wings, flapping hard to maintain as much height as possible as he glided forward. Gradually, he was drawing towards the canopy of leaves. Watching himself slowly drift downward, soaring over the treetops, it felt incredible to Dorian. He'd studied aerospace engineering as a college student, and knew quite a bit about the math and physics of how flight worked. But actually experiencing it, himself, through his own body, there was no feeling like it in the world. The control of his wings, his body's movement in flight, it all came naturally to him. He carefully guided himself towards a small opening between a pair of large trees, controlling his body with precision. He managed to sail through the gap in the leaves without a hitch, sliding into the forest. Graw awwrr. The instant he came under the cover of trees, Dorian was unfortunate enough to immediately encounter a beast. He forcibly stopped his gliding, coming to a halt and crashing down hard on the ground as he looked at the hulking beast in front of him, his eyes narrow. He had landed in the thick of the forest, on a small raised section. Trees dotted everywhere, gradually obscuring his vision. Right in front of him, just below, stood a large, 2.5-meter tall creature that looked like a bull with dark green hide. A pair of firm white tusks stuck out of its brutish mouth, its beady eyes glaring at him. It stomped its feet on the ground several times, its muscles rolling. "Hello there," he said aloud, staring at the creature in consternation. "Asra," he mentally queried, continuing to study the boar. A forest boar, powerful creatures prized for their tough horns and delicious meat. Its maximum growth places it at the middle of the sky class. A cool reply rang out in his head. Dorian shrugged, the tiny bead of concern in his heart fading away. His current body, right now, was at the early stage of master class. While he may not have the fighting instincts of a Mire Dragon, Dorian could feel the dense, rippling muscles and thick scales he now possessed. He wondered how much stronger he would be at the Grandmaster class. Grr! The boar gave a quieter growl, its body shivering. He looked down from the small hill he was on, shaking his head. "It's over, forest boar. I have the high ground." He rattled his claws, his eyes giving off a threatening gleam. Graw awwrr. The boar ignored him and charged, its tusks pointed at his chest. Each step it took threw up dirt and rock, clomping its way up the small hill. Dorian's eyes thinned to slits as he took a deep breath. He felt a feeling of warmth inside his body as he activated the ability he had just learned. It took a mere split second for a vast number of symbols in his soul to blast out from his soul spell matrix. After that split second, a powerful cascade of brilliant green flames burst from his mouth, blasting directly down towards the forest boar. These flames burned with a brilliant gleam, boiling forth like an unstoppable waterfall. As Dorian let them loose, he noticed that while he could see the flames burning through the air, the heat itself the flames gave off didn't seem to have much effect on him. The ability he was using seemed to not only create these powerful flames, but also protect him from them. He abruptly snapped his mouth shut, canceling the ability as he felt its drain on him. Every ability one used, like every spell a wizard cast, would create a physical and mental drain on one's body and their soul. Using too many could cause you to collapse, and even physically damage yourself. Whoosh, thud, the forest boar fell to the ground, roasted through and through. Its entire body was seared, cooked straight through to the core. The lesser emerald flames that Dorian had created were potent, with the strength to directly roast a sky-class beast in a single hit. He blinked hard as he considered this. Abilities, it seemed, were extremely valuable tools to have. Right now he had two. His Flame Claws ability from the Red Salamander, and his lesser emerald flames from the Mire Dragon. As he continued to evolve, taking in more and more forms, he would gain more and more abilities. A smile appeared on his face as he realized this. Even if he couldn't easily find a Lord-class bloodline, that didn't mean he couldn't grow stronger. A mesmerizing smell interrupted his thoughts. He looked down, staring at the roasted boar. The delicious scent of cooked meat was wafting up his nose, the fat and muscle on the boar's body just waiting to be devoured. Because he'd cooked it through and through, he ruefully realized he wouldn't be able to absorb its bloodline, though he hadn't been planning on it. His stomach rumbled, and Dorian realized he hadn't had anything to eat today, not after trying to eat that roasted deer, and then being rudely interrupted. He smiled. It seemed he would get to eat roasted meat today, in the end. He walked up to the fire and cut off several choice parts, stuffing some of them into the spatial pouch he had tied around his neck. He then turned towards the south, his innate sense of direction guiding him. He then set forward and continued on his way, munching on a roasted boar leg as he half-dashed through the forest, dancing a little dance at the delicious flavor of the cooked boar. I should think of light magic, as a Tao of light? William scratched his head at the thought, his mind focused on unpacking the inheritance of magic the esteemed wizard had left for him. He was more than halfway back to your city, smoothly flying high over the forest below. He'd decided to look at the magic he had inherited, trying to understand it. The thought process of the wizard, however, was extremely complex. Instead of an orthodox method of studying magic, focusing on learning one spell at a time, moving forward carefully with each step, the fallen angelic class wizard Jorge Volcander treated it like he was coming to an understanding of how light magic itself functioned. He moved away from simple memorization, and more to understanding the patterns and symbols that represented light magic and the concepts behind them. It was far too high level for William to truly understand, but it left him feeling impressed and small. The universe was so much bigger than him, and his understanding of it was far too insignificant. He continued to review the odd light magic, becoming more and more interested. Gradually, he began to focus on the first spell. Light magic. Healing touch. It was a spell that focused on healing another individual, drawing from the energy in the air around you. Light magic had powerful healing spells, and powerful destructive capabilities. Its one weakness would be its lack of powerful defensive spells. It had a few, but at a higher level was lacking compared to other branches of magic. He was in the midst of thought, tossing these concepts over in his head, when a loud, grinding noise interrupted him. A second altar his wooden vessel lurched to a halt, almost knocking him off his feet as he stumbled forward. William jerked his head up, his eyes widening in surprise. He raised his hands forward and readied himself to cast a spell, his body tense. A moment later he lowered them, recognizing what was before him. The familiar-looking transparent vessel that they had original flow to the Nebra Mountains in, from the spell of the royal wizard Aemon. Several floating, transparent chains had latched onto his wooden vessel, locking it in place. He mentally beat himself up for missing such an obvious ship approaching him. Being lost in thought like that was dangerous. "Hail, young wizard, are you all right?" A voice called out gruffly. A muscular man with long black hair and a short beard motioned at him. Behind him William could make out several other figures he didn't recognize, but one he did. The royal wizard Aemon. He could also feel an incredible concentration of energy on the people in that vessel, and instantly knew they were not only people he couldn't afford to cross, but people he needed to not even offend. Most of them were powerful wizards, though he could make out a few warriors with them. Black Iron Guards once more, powerful warriors from the capital. Yes, I'm fine. Can I help you? He asked politely, feeling as if he already knew the answer to that question. Yes, you can. You are William Roble, correct? The wizard that was injured and lost here earlier when attempting to capture a creature that caused a disturbance in fate. A stern-looking woman stepped forward, her long red hair tied up in a tight bun, with piercing green eyes that seemed to bore through his soul. Yes, William responded, nodding his head, though he wouldn't quite say he was lost. More like abandoned. Excellent. She motioned with her hand at him. I've already spoken with your family head. You will be justly rewarded for the pains you suffered. In addition, he has assigned you to assist us in tracking down that dragon. Her voice left no room for negotiation, her eyes cold. William sighed on the inside, feeling a deep-set unwillingness rise in him, alongside an even larger feeling of helplessness. He walked over towards the transparent vessel and boarded it, dismissing his own. Now, the woman began as he boarded, walking in front of him. A few of the wizards in the surrounding turned to stare at him. The muscular-looking wizard, meanwhile, turned to the front of the ship, ignoring them. Up close, William noticed several faint, black lines of energy floating around the man. Tell me exactly what you remember, or know, about that disturbance in fate, and how exactly you are still alive. The Wizard King Telman sighed, rubbing his forehead. His violet eyes pierced forward, looking into the distance, as if he was gazing at all existence. Instead of his grand throne room, he was currently sitting on a small, gray pillar in the middle of a forest clearing. Several small trees dotted the area, partially obscuring a set of ancient stone ruins, covered in mysterious hieroglyphics. Instead of his customary white robe, he wore a simple brown smock and a set of brown leather pants. Clothes an ordinary peasant would wear. The crown he normally wore on his head was nowhere to be seen. Off in the distance, roughly 20 miles away, an enormous floating edifice could be seen. A massive, dozen-mile-wide circle of white stone, supported by thousands of streams of white light, floating several hundred meters high in the sky. Upon this stone circle were tens of thousands of buildings, palaces, and all sorts of structures. A chaotic, expansive city, soaring in the sky. Tens of thousands of figures could be seen, flying in the sky to and fro near the city. The illustrious floating capital of the Boral Autarchy, Heavenseeker City. The holy land of wizards, where spellcasters went to seek the heavens. Cassiera. His voice was warm and gentle as he spoke, motioning off to the side. Immediately a figure blurred into existence, the world around her warping as she bowed. Her silky blonde hair and her green eyes added a certain fire to her eager smile, making her appearance one of beauty. She was lean and fit, the curves of her body visible through the tight blue dress she wore. Your Highness. The adoration in her voice was thick. Your report. The Wizard King gave her a calm nod. We've gained a deeper understanding of the creatures that have caused a disturbance in fate. At least, of the 32 in worlds under our control. She began, flipping her hair back behind her as she clapped her hands. A small sheath of notes appeared that she began to scan through. He interrupted her. The casualties first, he asked, his voice steady. Cassiera looked down, her eager smile fading. 3 Lord-class wizards, more than 30 Grandmaster-class wizards, and roughly 220 Master-class wizards. The number of civilians or those at a lower class killed in action is expected to number in the hundreds of thousands in wake of the widespread destruction. A hint of sadness filled her tone. The Wizard King sat calmly, his voice not displaying a single emotion as he heard her report. I see. The immediacy of this threat seemed to be much higher than previously thought. 27 of the 32 anomalies, as we have taken to calling them, possess clear Lord-class strength, ranging from the early stage to the peak Pseudo-King class. All of them possess incredibly powerful bloodlines, many of them ancient and thought extinct. Some, perhaps all, of them appear to possess the ability to transform their physical body. She said, frowning. They are not only incredibly strong, but fate itself seems to warp around them, usually in their favor. This has made it exceptionally difficult for any of the teams the departments sent out to capture any of them. Spells go slightly awry, coincidences occur, luck seems to turn just right for them. She continued, Unfortunately, it is extremely difficult to track Lord-class figures through fate for any extended period of time, and as a result several of the anomalies have escaped from our sight. We are currently working to track them. She waved her hands forward as she added, "The manner in which they arrived here set off faint waves through fate, and we are attempting to pinpoint their locations in this manner, though we estimate these waves will die down in roughly a week." Not a single one was captured, despite the casualties? Were any of them killed? Telman's voice was dangerously calm. Yes, sir. The Lord-class volcanic wizard Petrion perished taking out an anomaly that had the bloodline of an ancient Borakian wood giant, also at the Lord class. The corpse of the beast is currently being transported towards the capital. Cassiera bowed her head again, trembling. Telman simply glanced at her, taking the information in before waving his hand. The other 5? Cassiera bit her lip as she responded. 3 of them we were unable to find at all, and believe they have either gone dormant or decided to hide themselves and succeeded. One of them we aren't quite sure on its strength. The reports I've gleaned from our fate wizards in the area indicate it's a Lord-class draconic beast, an incredibly odd one. But, from my own investigation into fate, she shrugged, I detected remnants of a mid-king class aura. Telman frowned when he heard this. What was so odd about it? Are you certain of the aura remnants? A mid-king class beast. This could prove troublesome for even some of the department heads. Beasts that had powerful bloodlines were very difficult to deal with. Yes, absolutely certain. As for why it was odd, apparently when they discovered it, it was found singing a song in an unknown language while dancing around a fire. The Wizard King stared at her for a brief moment, blinking his eyes several times. Dancing around a fire? Yes, sir, dancing around a fire. She responded promptly. While singing? Yes, sir, while singing. She responded again, just as prompt. He rubbed his forehead again, closing his eyes, sighing deeply. What team is in the area of that particular anomaly? The Lord-class wizard Hadrian, the rising star of the Black Lightning Department. He is all the way on the outer world of Hosnorth, sir. 2 additional teams are expected to arrive to assist him, from the Sundering Department and the Darkness Department. She responded promptly. Telman closed his eyes, and then opened them, a deadly light gleaming in them. Send an order through fate when we are done talking. Which fate wizard does he have by his side? I remember him. It was Lara, right? The 5th disciple of your 3rd disciple? He rubbed his forehead again, a tired look appearing on his face. Tell him he is to pull back, immediately. Order the same to all teams that are attempting to engage this threat. No Lord-class wizard is to go at any anomaly without at least 4 other Lord-class wizards to assist. As for the potential King class, only department heads are to engage with it. His words were full of authority, shaking the air itself. My message might not make it through in time, due to how far away he is. Cassiera said, bowing her head. Telman waved his hand, indicating it wasn't a problem. He then turned, and looked at Cassiera with a question in his eyes. The last one? The beautiful, blonde-haired woman's mouth twisted. The last one was found on the major planet of Nora, near our border with the Graal Alliance. 2 Lord-class wizards, Andre from the Gravity Department and Orman from the Diamond Department, went to engage it simultaneously. She paused briefly. They were both killed in action. The anomaly there appears to be a king-class beast that is at the very peak, almost pseudo-angelic class, with the bloodline of a divine golden lion. She looked at him. The Wizard King blinked slowly, and then folded his hands together slowly. His eyes shivered with emotion at the mention of word, divine. Continue. It left a message after it killed them, declared with enough force that roughly 10,000 nearby civilians died from the yell alone. She motioned with her hands at the notes she held. It said, tell the firstborn that I, the secondborn, will be coming for my rightful title. Promptly after that, it went on a rampage killing thousands of beasts in the wild. Its activities after that we are unsure of, save that it left Nora headed in the direction of the planets controlled by the Graal Alliance. Telman took a few moments to think, his eyes cool. Inform the department heads there to take action immediately to target these threats and eliminate them. Each department is to avoid leaking information and causing a panic. In addition, tell the Royal Knights to appear before me in the throne room. He sighed, shaking his head. I would move personally if I could, I have a bad feeling about this. He turned, looking out into the distance at something not visible. Send your messages first, and then continue your report. How have the Draconic tribes and the Grawl Alliance reacted? Have the Shades or Nobles made any movements?